After transcribing the final character of the Figaro formula, Lin Yun carefully closed his magic book, his fingers lingering on its ancient cover before he stepped out of the decaying, desolate library. A vast crack split across the sky, a scar left by the raging netherstorm. The blood-red sun, dim and weary, cast its final desperate rays, spilling oppressive heat over the land. The cruel, searing light enveloped the ruined city, generating waves of steam that leached the last vestiges of life from its crumbling remains. At the heart of the city, the shelter tower still functioned, though its dim, flickering glow carried a sense of finality. Like an old guardian, steadfast but past its prime, standing as the last beacon of hope for High City. For 3 millennia, it had shielded the remnants of civilization, but its waning radiance only served as a grim reminder that the end was near. This was no scent, a world that once birthed a glorious magical civilization, now teetering on the brink of oblivion, its mana nearly depleted. In its golden age, no scent had been a utopia of arcane mastery, where mages wielded unfathomable power, conquering distant plains and subjugating entire races with a mere flick of their staves. Their magic defied reason, shaking the very fabric of existence. Some had even dared to proclaim themselves as living gods. Perhaps, had mana remained abundant, they truly would have transcended mortality, bending the cosmos to their will. But that grandeur crumbled with the slow and relentless exhaustion of the world's mana. One by one, those powerful mages fell. Their unparalleled spells faded into memory, their world-shattering magic nothing more than an echo of the past. The great fleets of arcane warships lay abandoned, their once mighty crystal cannons now silent relics of an age long gone. The conquered plains, once trembling beneath Nascent's might, regained their peace as the conquerors weakened, unable to maintain their hold. Even the most legendary of Nascent's mages, those who had once rivaled deities, found themselves powerless before time's cruel march. Their once immortal names, spoken with reverence in ages past, were now mere inscriptions on forgotten tombstones, testaments to an era reduced to dust and ruin. Only their knowledge remained, locked away in the silent halls of places like the library Lin Yun had just left. Books filled with the wisdom of generations, once treasured above all else, now sat untouched beneath a thick layer of dust, their magic rendered meaningless in a world devoid of mana. To Lin Yun, they held no more value than idle reading material. What use were spells that required an abundance of mana in a dying world? Even the Figaro formula he had just copied, designed to extract the smallest traces of mana from the void, was of infinitely greater worth than the grandest incantations recorded in those books. Just my luck, Lin Yun muttered bitterly. For 20 years, ever since he had inexplicably arrived in No Scent, he had lamented his misfortune. Wasn't a transmigrator supposed to change the fate of their world, rising to glory and living a life of fulfillment? Yet here he was, struggling to survive in a dying land, scrabbling for scraps in an endless desert, doomed to perish alongside this fading world. Why couldn't he have arrived at a different time? Perhaps in Nascent's early years, when magic was still young and its wonders still being discovered. Back then, though mankind had yet to reach its peak, they had boundless potential. They still stood on the precipice of miracles, their future filled with endless possibilities. At least then, the sky hadn't been ripped apart by the netherstorm, and the lands hadn't turned into lifeless wastelands. Back then, mana had been inexhaustible, flowing through the world like a river of endless power. And most importantly, people hadn't yet been haunted by the looming specter of total annihilation. Lin Yun sighed heavily, dragging his exhausted body down an empty, silent street. No sounds disturbed the eerie stillness. It was as if he were the last soul left in this desolate world. Nascent's death was inevitable. Each day, its remaining resources dwindled further. High City's already sparse population was fading, and at this rate, humanity might not even last long enough to witness the world's final collapse. Soon, this city would be nothing more than a true ghost town. The suffocating silence sent a shiver through Lin Yun. Wait, a shiver? His body tensed as realization struck. In 20 years of enduring the relentless sun and the scorching desert, he had forgotten what cold felt like. Yet now, a creeping chill slithered down his spine like the breath of a lurking predator. A sense of foreboding gripped him. Slowly, he lifted his head, and his breath caught in his throat. The sky above Heiss had turned pitch black. The shelter tower's faint glow had flickered out. A gaping void consumed the heavens, swallowing every last trace of light. And in that abyss, something stirred. The nether storm, unchecked and unstoppable, tore through the sky as a flaming meteor hurtled toward the land below. The fragile space shattered under its force, sending shockwaves rippling through the dying city. The dunes beyond Heiss churned violently, forming monstrous waves of sand that surged toward the city like an unstoppable tide. The earth trembled, buildings crumbling into dust as desperate screams filled the air. Blood, fire, and chaos consumed Heiss. The end had finally come. Lin Yun stood frozen, staring at the apocalyptic spectacle, his mind blank with shock. And then, the darkness swallowed everything. It was no longer cracked and blood-red. There was no nether storm, no endless desert. Instead, an expanse of azure stretched overhead. Verdant forests swayed in the breeze, rivers roared through vast mountain ranges, and the air itself shimmered with a tangible aura of mana. Compared to the barren wasteland he had known for 20 years, this no scent felt like an extravagant paradise, overflowing with the very essence of magic. It was a world so rich in mana that it practically suffused every breath he took. The name Mafa Merlin surfaced, belonging to the original owner of this body, a 9th-rank magic apprentice, tutored by Archmage Sethman, the son of Loch Merlin, a successful businessman who had owned Flashing Gold, one of the 7 great alchemy chambers of commerce in Thousand Sail City. A promising life, a wealthy heritage, or at least it had been, until disaster struck. Loch Merlin's fleet was swallowed by a storm, sinking to the ocean's depths along with its priceless cargo. The tragedy shook Thousand Sail City to its core and shattered the once thriving Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce. Creditors descended like vultures, stripping the business of its wealth. Victims' families came daily, demanding compensation. Even Mafa's magic studies had been forced to a halt as the burden of debt crushed him. His once grand home now stood empty, abandoned by servants and friends alike. Only a loyal old butler remained at his side. And then there was the contract. Locke's younger cousin, Ferio, had arrived, waving a document that demanded immediate payment of a debt Mafa could never afford. This was the state of things when Lin Yun, now Mafa Merlin, opened his eyes to this new world. Truly unlucky, Lin Yun muttered, shaking his head. Mafa Merlin had been on the brink of despair. But Lin Yun? He had just been given a second chance. Lin Yun quickly pushed aside his lingering thoughts and focused on something far more pressing, his own body. This was what truly mattered. After surviving 20 years in Nascent's decaying final era, Lin Yun had developed an almost obsessive thirst for mana. Without it, he wouldn't have lasted an hour in that world. Between the savage sand beasts, the relentless heat, and the deadly radiation of the nether storm, mana had been his only lifeline. He hadn't relied on noble lineage or a promising future to survive. Instead, he had depended on his exceptional control over mana. Lin Yun didn't care about how physically weak this new body was or the debts hanging over his head. A 9th-rank magic apprentice was insignificant. If Mafa had been an archmage, no one would have dared to demand repayment, let alone insist on 8,000 gold. Even if he had decided to pay them back, they wouldn't have dared accept it. As Lin Yun examined his new body, he found that Mafa Merlin wasn't entirely hopeless. Though only a 9th-rank magic apprentice, his foundations were solid. Years of dedicated study had brought him to the threshold of forming a mana whirlpool, but a lack of fine control had held him back from advancing. This was laughably easy for Lin Yun. Having spent 2 decades in an era where mana was scarce, he had perfected his control over it. Every mage of that time had to master the art of extracting and utilizing even the smallest traces of mana. Only by reaching the pinnacle of efficiency could they survive the netherstorm and the scorching deserts. Compared to those desperate times, modern mages seemed utterly clumsy in their approach. It took Lin Yun 10 minutes to analyze his body's potential. Once he fully understood it, he began to gather mana. Guided by his precision, the initially sluggish flow of mana started moving, like a quiet stream trickling through untouched land. But as Lin Yun continued his methodical guidance, the gentle current transformed into a surging river, crashing against the limits of his body. For most magic apprentices, this was a critical moment. Losing control of the rushing mana could mean complete failure. The mana whirlpool would collapse, and they would have to start accumulating mana from scratch, a setback so severe that it could permanently shatter their hopes of becoming a mage. This was why there were many magic apprentices, but few archmages. It was also why Mafa had hesitated to take this step for 3 years, fearing failure. Lin Yun, however, had no such concerns. His mastery of mana was second nature. Without the slightest hesitation, he refined the surging energy, shaping it with absolute control. No matter how fiercely the mana roared, he directed it effortlessly, forcing it into the precise pathways he dictated. Within moments, the mana whirlpool was fully formed. With this step completed, he had officially gained a right to wear the black robes of a mage. Given time, the whirlpool would stabilize, marking the true completion of his breakthrough. But Lin Yun didn't stop there. Ignoring the natural limits, he forcefully pushed the mana beyond its breaking point. The fragile whirlpool trembled before shattering under the immense pressure. He remained unfazed. Gathering mana once more, he reconstructed the whirlpool, only to shatter it again. He repeated this process 10 times, each cycle reinforcing the structure until it became unnaturally stable. By the end, his mana whirlpool was no longer fragile. It was refined to perfection, capable of withstanding immense force without collapsing. Satisfied, Lin Yun gathered a small amount of mana at its core. The whirlpool began rotating ceaselessly, its stability unquestionable. He raised a hand, and shimmering runes materialized around him, accompanied by a powerful magical fluctuation. The very air hummed with energy. Even the most discerning mages would have no choice but to acknowledge the superiority of this mana whirlpool. It had both resilience and explosive potential, rivaling that of elite mages. The astonishing part? Lin Yun had accomplished all of this within minutes. This technique, which seemed absurd by contemporary standards, was an advanced method developed centuries later. Mages of that distant future had discovered that by repeatedly breaking and reforming a mana whirlpool, they could forge a structure far superior to the conventional method. After hundreds of years of refinement, it had become the gold standard for mana control, a technique Lin Yun had mastered in the dying age of no scent. Just as he was about to fortify his newfound power, an unwelcome voice reached his ears from outside. "It's all written in the contract. Before my dear cousin left for his voyage, he took 8,000 gold from me as an investment. The business failed, so shouldn't I get my money back? Of course, I'm not unreasonable. I know you don't have the money right now. So here's my offer. This house is still worth something. I'll take it off your hands for 10,000 gold. That way, you can settle your debt and still have 2,000 left to spend." The voice was grating, hoarse and nasal, like an obnoxious duck. Lin Yun, who had been deeply immersed in his mana refinement, felt his patience snap. "I don't have time for this," he muttered through clenched teeth, already contemplating the best way to shut the man up. Before he could rise, the intruder made himself even more unbearable by barging into the room with a loud bang. A corpulent man, easily weighing over 150 kilograms, staggered inside, dragging an elderly butler along with him. The two were locked in a struggle, their disagreement evident. "Let go of me, old man. You think you can stop me?" the fat man spat. "You're just a butler. This isn't your concern. Ferio, you know very well that the 8,000 gold was a gift from Master Locke. It was meant to be taken from the voyage's profits. You never invested a single coin. The old butler, Pavey, glared at the man, his face red with anger. Now that the master is gone, you want to seize his house? Do you have no shame? Watch your tongue, old man, Ferio snarled. Or what? Linyon interrupted, his tone calm yet cold. Ferio faltered. He had expected resistance from the butler, but not from the young man himself. For years, he had dismissed Maffa Merlin as nothing more than a spoiled child squandering gold in pursuit of an unattainable dream. The boy had begged for an extension on the debt, proof enough that he wasn't a true mage. But now, standing before him, was someone entirely different. And something about that icy gaze sent an unfamiliar chill down his spine.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
What is going on today? After Ferio spat disdainfully, he couldn't help feeling a bit puzzled. He was waving the contract around, but that kid didn't hurriedly start talking about it or begging for an extension. He was just sitting there, seeming very carefree, and he was looking at him very strangely. That gaze didn't seem to be one that would be given to a creditor, but more like one that would be used when looking at a ridiculous clown. Ferio wanted to shout a few ruthless threats to cow this kid into a wretch that would fall down and start begging him once again, but for some reason, the words he wanted to say got stuck in his throat. The most frightening thing was that he suddenly felt like he needed to gather himself a bit when he saw this nephew in person again after so long. It's not important, he finally managed to say. In any case, either you repay your debt today, or you use the house to repay the debt. Otherwise, I'll hand this contract to Thousand Sails City's Chambers of Commerce Union. Let's see who will dare to do business with your flashing gold chamber of commerce after that. These words even made the old housekeeper pale and worry. Ferio's threat was truly vicious. The flashing gold chamber of commerce was in dire straits, and even its buildings had been seized by others to repay the debts. But the old butler knew that much of this would be temporary. The old master had built his connections and his reputation over the decades, and those weren't things that would be taken away from one accident at sea. As long as the flashing gold chamber of commerce had some time, it could get out of its predicament. And even if it couldn't reach its former glory, it would certainly provide enough for the young master to not have to worry about food and clothing. It might even be possible for him to continue his magic studies, and maybe one day he could become a true mage. But they definitely couldn't let him give the contract to the Union. The Chamber of Commerce would need its reputation in order to survive. If the Union even had to make a decision on this, it would definitely have a negative effect on their reputation as doubts would spread. The old butler's face turned white and his right hand, which had been pulling at Ferio's sleeve, slowly started shivering. But quite strangely, Lin Yun was still relaxed, as if he hadn't heard Ferio's malicious threat. He joked to the old butler, "I told you that uncle was concerned about us. See, he is already worried that no one will do business with us." "Young master, you are jesting," the old butler forced out, an unsightly look on his face. Lin Yun smiled, but didn't say much more. He had some respect for this old butler. For him to remain despite the flashing gold chamber of commerce crumbling around them, and to do his best to defend Maffa Merlin. He had already gone far beyond his required duties as a butler. "Good kid, don't be a hypocrite and act apathetic. We still have to talk about business." Even if Ferio had thick skin, he couldn't help becoming angry from Lin Yun's sarcastic mockery. "You already saw the contract. Your father took 8,000 gold from me. I'll give you two paths. One is to pay now directly, and the other is to use your house as payment. I still have business to take care of, so don't waste my time." "The house is definitely a no," Lin Yun retorted. "Your price is too fair. I'm worried you'll suffer a loss." Back in the day, the house had been purchased for about 100,000 gold, so using a debt of 8,000 to purchase it was indeed overly fair. Ferio's expression seemed almost murderous as he ignored Lin Yun's sarcasm and pressed on. "So, you'll be paying the gold directly?" Paying back with gold coins isn't impossible, Lin Yun began before trailing off. You really want to pay back the gold? This answer was far beyond Ferrio's expectations. He was feeling quite stunned and confused because all of Thousand Sail City knew that after the accident at sea, the flashing gold chamber of commerce was already in the red. Even this house left by Loch Merlin was completely emptied by the family members of the victims, and there was not even a single rat to be seen here. How could they come up with the money? No way. That would be impossible. After watching Ferrio's fat silhouette flee into the distance, Lin Yun turned back around and looked at Jimmy's two thugs. Still not leaving? Are you waiting for me to invite you to stay for dinner? The two dumb thugs were knocked out of their stupor by Lin Yun's words. We're on our way, let's go. Once the two thugs carried Jimmy away, the big house once again regained its peace, and Lin Yun led the old butler to a chair. The bruises on his arm had been wrapped. They weren't much of a hindrance, but he was still frowning as he muttered, "Young master, the 8,000 gold. Rest assured, I can deal with it," Lin Yun casually answered. He truly didn't take a debt of a mere 8,000 gold seriously. The reason behind this wasn't the fact that the concept of currency had fallen out of use near the end of the world. In fact, Lin Yun thirsted for money more than anyone else. He'd long since had his fill of that world where people would fight to the death for a bit of fresh water. His situation was far better now. As long as he was wealthy enough, he could buy anything that he needed or wanted. But 8,000 really wasn't much, at least for someone who was far beyond the mages of this era. Repaying 8,000 gold coins wouldn't give him much trouble at all, since he had many ways he could get that much within 3 days. Given that he'd just had a narrow escape from the end of the world via transmigration, then ended up in an unfamiliar body, and finally was confronted moments later by Ferrio and Jimmy. After all this, his mind was in a mess, so how could he still have time to think about a mere 8,000 gold? But even if he didn't care about it, it didn't mean that his butler wouldn't. Seeing his young master's carefree face, the old butler hurriedly warned, "Young master, we can't really get this sum for the time being. In order to compensate for the losses, we already sold all our properties and compensated the family members of the deceased. We really have no money. I just remembered that when my father was alive, he put an alchemy workshop under my name, didn't he?" Lin Yun had looked through Maffa Merlin's memories and found this fact rather interesting. But although the workshop was under his name, it would normally be operated by Loch Merlin's people. The only thing his father had done was to make it easier for him to purchase magic materials and reagents. That alchemy workshop is still there, but after the accident at sea, the 3 alchemists all left. I don't blame them. With the current situation of the flashing gold chamber of commerce, they also need to think of themselves, the old butler explained while shaking his head. The most important part of an alchemy workshop was its alchemists. Loch Merlin had spent a great amount to get those 3 alchemists who were at the peak of Thousand Sail City from the other chambers of commerce. If they had stayed, they might not have been able to let the flashing gold chamber of commerce truly rise again on their own, but there wouldn't have been an issue with dealing with the current crisis. After all, that was an extremely lucrative business, and it would easily generate much more than 8,000 gold. Unfortunately, all 3 of the alchemists left, and even if there were still materials left in the warehouse, they would only be cheap goods. Without the abilities of an alchemist to turn certain raw materials into gold or other things, selling all of that certainly wouldn't be enough to repay the debt. Anyways, let's take a look. Young master wants to take a look? The old butler froze for a bit, feeling a bit strange. Ever since his young master woke up from that fainting spell, he seemed a bit different. The previous Maffa Merlin never would have been able to say such bold words in front of that wretched Ferrio. And there was that Jimmy. The miserable scene of him howling and weeping after his right hand was burnt scared the butler too. His young master didn't even frown or wince and remained perfectly calm while roasting the thug's hand. It was as if he had become a totally different person from the anxiously sighing young master from a few days ago. Young master truly grew up from facing the adversity. Unfortunately, master will never be able to see it. As the two talked, footsteps could be heard on the other side of the door. This guest was a youth that seemed to be about 20 years old and was not very tall. He was wearing a black gown, on the cuffs of which was embroidered a wyvern. This was the standard gown of Auckland, the best magic school in the eastern side of the kingdom. This was definitely a student of the Auckland Magic School, and he must have already become a mage, because only a mage was qualified to wear a black gown. That young mage hurriedly entered without waiting for permission of any sort. After a glance at old Pavy's dusty bandage, he suddenly grew angry. "Maffa Merlin, look at what you did. My father has worked for your Merlin family for more than 30 years, and now he still has to help you deal with your mess. Is this the worth of the Merlin family? How could you feel no shame letting my father be harmed like this?" "Raymond, shut up." The old butler loudly berated his son and wanted to explain what happened in defense of his young master. But the problem was that Raymond had quite a temper. How could he listen to an explanation upon seeing his father hurt like this? His father had worked for the Merlins for over 30 years. He had always worked tirelessly without any complaint and been unerringly loyal. Even though the flashing gold chamber of commerce was now sinking, he still stubbornly remained to take care of that young master. And what was the result? After the news of the accident at sea had spread, Raymond had become very worried. He was afraid of what his father might encounter here, as people came to demand money. So he found a way to apply for a 10-day vacation before traveling from Fallen Star Lakeside to Thousand Sail City. And on the way, he found out that Loch Merlin's younger cousin, Fario, had hired Jimmy and brought him to collect a debt. Raymond had grown up in Thousand Sail City as a child. How could he not know who Jimmy was? He hurried toward the Merlin family house, his heart burning from anxiety, and as he entered, he noticed his father's appearance. The anger he felt was naturally redirected toward Lin Yun. To be honest, Raymond had always been looking down on Maffa. This young master had a rich and powerful father, and had always been given the best conditions after stepping into the world of magic, even getting the chance to be mentored by an archmage. When he needed materials for experiments, his father simply gifted him an alchemy shop. Every year, he would use up at least 100,000 gold. But despite enjoying these superior circumstances, he had always been lingering at the door to becoming a mage. After so many years, after so much money used, he was still a mere 9th-rank magic apprentice. Raymond had always believed that if he'd been given these benefits, he would have had far more achievements already. Later on, Raymond successfully became a mage and returned to look at that Maffa Merlin. But there was no envy or jealousy anymore. Since he was a mage, he couldn't envy or be jealous of a mere magic apprentice, because the two belonged to two different worlds, and it seemed unlikely that they would intersect. Like those professors of the school said, an inferior existence like a perennial magic apprentice couldn't even enter the eye of a mage. "Young master, I'm really sorry. This little brat shouted at you without knowing anything. Just wait. I'll scold him and make him apologize to you." It doesn't matter. Raymond is still young, so it's quite normal for him to be impetuous. After saying a few words to the old butler, Lin Yun just headed for the door. Just before going out, he said, "Oh right, Raymond, your father was injured and needs to rest. You got here at just the right time. Follow me to the Gilded Rose." Raymond almost choked in anger. Does that scoundrel want to die? A mere 9th-rank magic apprentice actually used that kind of tone to order around a great mage. Unfortunately, this great mage didn't have time to explode in anger, as the old butler on the side exploded in anger first. "You little dolt, do you want to anger me to death?" Okay, I got it. Raymond did not have a mother as a child, so he had been raised solely by old Pavy. Raymond was both respectful toward and somewhat afraid of his father. When he saw how angry his father had gotten, the young mage's dignity was immediately thrown to the back of his head. He smiled and asked about his father's injury, and after confirming that everything was okay, he picked up his magic wand and chased after Lin Yun. The road from a Merlin house to the Gilded Rose was about a 20-minute walk. On the way, Raymond didn't really look at Lin Yun. For the sake of his old man, he would at least show the veneer of good grace. But if this fellow didn't know his place, then Raymond would definitely try to embarrass him. Raymond was quite sure about what Maffa Merlin's goal was. An apprentice stuck at the 9th rank managed to get in touch with a true mage. How could he not take the opportunity to try to befriend him? Not mentioning anything else, just Raymond's own experience of forming the mana whirlpool would be enough to help Mafa Merlin avoid countless detours. As long as this young Master Merlin wasn't a fool, he would definitely ask all kinds of questions. When he comes and tries to befriend me, I'll stop playing along and taunt him, and then use the tone of mage to chastise him. Good, sounds like a plan. Thus, Raymond waited for his quarry to approach. As a result, this 5th rank mage waited for a long time. The 20 minutes were almost over, yet that scoundrel was still acting, walking at a steady pace with his head lowered and his hands clasped behind his back, a thoughtful look on his face the entire time. What's with that thoughtful look? You're just an apprentice. What kind of profound question could you even be thinking of? After waiting and waiting, as time passed, Raymond couldn't wait any longer, and his mind had become filled with who knew how many curses. This scoundrel can really act. Hurry up and ask me for guidance. Can't you see that I've been waiting for a long time? If you don't hurry up, we will reach the Gilded Rose, and by then, there will be no onlookers. What would be the point of me taunting you then? This won't do. I have to think of a way to bring it up myself. Oh, right, young Master Merlin. Did your teacher tell you which specific few formulas you should master when preparing to form the mana whirlpool? Raymond was extremely pleased with himself after asking this question. It was a perfect suggestion, and the arrogance of a senior from a magic school was plastered all over his face. Then, Raymond waited for quite a long time. He turned and saw that the youth beside him was still looking down at the ground with his hands behind his back, seeming to be thinking about something. Fuck, that's too much. Veins could be seen palpitating on Raymond's forehead. I'm a great mage, yet I took the initiative to speak with a mere apprentice like you. Even if you aren't overwhelmed with awe, you still shouldn't dare to ignore me. Do you want to die? Hey, young Master Merlin. Raymond restrained himself once again, restraining the urge to curse at him, and raised his voice to shout. What? Linyan finally snapped out of his reverie with great difficulty. He was a loss first, before finally managing to react. Oh, the formulas that need to be mastered before forming the mana whirlpool. That's simple. The Nosen formula can be used to form the foundation of the mana whirlpool. The Gilded formula is used to calculate the direction of the mana, and if the conditions are met, it's best to master the Figaro formula. This way, you could save a lot of mana when building the mana whirlpool. After saying that, he threw Raymond a strange look and asked, in fact, isn't this knowledge that an apprentice should know about already? Raymond suddenly became angry, almost stomping the ground. What does he mean by that? I'm a great mage. Do I still need you to teach me knowledge of mere apprentices? This won't do. I have to think of another way to shame that scoundrel. Raymond was fuming, but unfortunately for him, before he could think of a way, they reached the Gilded Rose. The Gilded Rose was located in the Victorious Return Main Street. This was the most flourishing zone of Thousand Sail City. The most people, the most expensive goods, everything was concentrated on this lavish street. With the power of the flashing gold chamber of commerce at that time, Loch Merlin was able to let the Gilded Rose enter Victorious Return Street after a few jokes and some compliments. But with the decline of the flashing gold chamber of commerce, the originally bustling Gilded Rose was now deserted. The three-peak alchemists of Thousand Sail City had left early on, and they had taken a lot of expensive alchemy materials with them. Their reasoning was that the flashing gold chamber of commerce was behind on paying their salary, so they took materials as replacements. But in reality, what they took was worth 10 times their salary. They only left behind the most inexpensive reagents. Admittedly, the flashing gold chamber of commerce truly was unable to pay their salary at that point. Even Ferrio's 8,000 gold couldn't be repaid, so the salaries of those alchemists, which amounted to tens of thousands, didn't even need mentioning. And after all that, if the clerks leaving one after the other were added to the mix, each taking this or that, the formerly highly respected Gilded Rose was now but an empty shell of what it had once been. In fact, if not for the old butler noticing the strange situation and hurriedly sealing the warehouse, even those remaining cheap reagents might have been filched away. When Linyan opened the door and entered the Gilded Rose, he couldn't see anything. The previously dazzling shelves were now completely empty, and dust filled the air, which had a moldy smell. "This is too much," Raymond sighed after entering, a look of pity appearing on his face. But he was already inwardly gloating. Despair? Shock. Thinking of the time when you were a rich young master that didn't have to worry about food and clothing? Thinking of that formerly lucrative Gilded Rose? Don't joke with me. The flashing gold chamber of commerce already collapsed. The Gilded Rose already withered, and you're just a ninth-rank magic apprentice, one that has been stuck there for years. Nothing more. Raymond was ready for despair to appear on that scoundrel's face so that he could jeer at him. But after waiting for a long time, Raymond couldn't wait any longer. He realized that something was wrong. After that insufferable wretch entered, he didn't react at all. He was neither stunned nor losing hope. Even his own exaggerated sigh and head shake hadn't drawn a reaction. It was as if the youth didn't even look around and just passed straight through the empty lobby to go to the back of the Gilded Rose. "Hey!" Raymond started speaking, wanting to needle some sort of reaction out, but he trailed off because that guy was walking too fast. By the time Raymond had thought of something to say, he could only see his back. "Damn, just wait until I teach you a lesson." Raymond inwardly cursed while sullenly chasing after Moffa Merlin. They turned left after heading out the back door and then down a narrow street that led to the warehouse of the Gilded Rose. When Raymond caught up, Lin Yun had already unlocked the entrance of the warehouse with his keys. He had entered and was standing in a daze among all kinds of cheap materials. "You ran off so fast," Raymond started, intending to grumble a bit after catching up, but after seeing Lin Yun's appearance, he cut himself short. There was no need to grumble. The lad had run into his misfortune so quickly that Raymond hadn't even had time to celebrate it yet. So how could he complain about that? As he observed the lifeless look on that scoundrel's face, Raymond felt a lot better. It seemed that he was finally dumbstruck by the discovery of the cheap materials that were left behind. Altogether, they wouldn't even be worth 1,000 gold. So how could he use them to settle his debt? His fatty uncle wasn't a philanthropist. It actually took Raymond great effort to restrain himself from bursting out into maniacal laughter. But Raymond definitely wasn't aware of Lin Yun's actual thoughts. Lin Yun was also making great efforts to restrain himself from letting out maniacal laughter. Based on the memories left behind by Moffa Merlin, Lin Yun had been aware that the current era was rich in resources. Despite this, after seeing the materials piled around, Lin Yun was stunned. He hadn't thought that this era would be flourishing to such an extent, let alone the other stuff, just those 3 full boxes of red coral. What kind of concept was that? In his later era, just a few pieces would have been enough to trigger an intense conflict in the relatively monotonous land of Heiss. Oh, and that bag of moonlight sand too. It might not have been possible to dig out that much even after hundreds of years of digging in the deserts. Had it novel been at? Hold on, that thing over there. After forcing his stare away from the moonlight sand, he was quickly attracted by a bright light. This wouldn't be the rumored magic iron? Lin Yun subconsciously gulped, focusing his gaze on that glimmer in the corner of the warehouse, carrying a fierce magic fluctuation. This can't magic iron, right? This was the first time Lin Yun had ever seen real magic iron. That exceptional magic metal simply didn't exist at the end of the magic era. A few millennia before Lin Yun transmigrated, the last piece of magic metal had already been extracted, and in the endless years that followed, people could only look at the descriptions of their incredible properties by poring over books. All the magic metals were gifts of the earth. They naturally had unique magic power, and with some special handling, they could become powerful alchemy items. If they fell into the hands of a powerful alchemist, they might even have the chance to become a magic tool, such as the shelter tower in the middle of Heiss. That was the greatest magic tool in all of Nascent's history. It was able to stall for time in a world that should have already been destroyed, delaying the final days for thousands of years. This power already couldn't be described as just a miracle. After circling the warehouse, Lin Yun couldn't help cursing inwardly. This really is an utterly heartless era filled with an abundance of resources. Magic iron thrown in a corner, 3 boxes of red coral, a whole pouch of moonlight sand, and they all are given the same description, cheap magic material. Too extravagant, too wasteful. Lin Yun gulped and then forced himself to not look at those treasures any longer. He was like a starving man that had just seen a table filled with delicious food. The fact that he wasn't shrieking and pouncing at the materials could already be considered an incredible show of self-restraint. But even Lin Yun's self-restraint couldn't stop him from falling into a daze. Afterwards, Lin Yun finally recovered and got on the move. The 3 boxes of red coral were quickly emptied, followed by the full bag of moonlight sand, and naturally, the few pieces of magic iron weren't let off either. After 5 trips, everything in the warehouse was moved to the Gilded Rose's Alchemy laboratory. Raymond seemed rather confused about these actions. What kind of stimulus had that young master felt to make him suddenly act so strangely? Did he crack from the pressure and lose his mind? Could it be that he didn't notice that after taking 5 trips back and forth, becoming drenched in sweat, he had only moved less than 500 gold worth of stuff? Would Ferrio's debt claim a second victim in the family? Aside from the 3 boxes full of red corals, there was also a bag full of moonlight sand. But these things were all the most common magic materials in no cent. One only needed to throw out a few coins to buy a large pile. Those pieces of magic iron were still worth a bit, but the problem was that there was no alchemist. All he had was himself. Did he plan to use his teeth to magically transform it? He's finished, he truly lost his mind. Raymond got a headache. He didn't care if that scoundrel suffered, but did he have to involve those around him too? The old man who worked for the family for decades treated that insufferable fool as his own son. If he learned that this pompous brat had lost his mind shortly after Raymond's arrival, Raymond would definitely have bad days ahead of him. The problem was that he really was innocent. While Raymond's mind was in a mess, Lin Yun had found a few cat's eye gems hidden behind the box, so he looked around some more. After making sure that he hadn't missed anything, he called out to Raymond, "Come help me." He didn't wait for Raymond's answer and just took a few gems that were relatively pure before walking out. As he was left behind, Raymond felt stunned. "You think I'll help just because you asked me for it? Am I your friend? Besides, you dare to ask a great mage like me to help you work with such cheap magic materials? Are you joking? Do you think a mage is someone you can hire in the streets for a few coppers?" Raymond entered the Gilded Rose while full of complaints. "Let's agree on something. Don't look for me for troublesome things. I can't waste mana like this. Don't think that a mage can spend mana so casually. The mana that we mages use isn't something that an apprentice like you can imagine. Hey, are you listening to me?" After Raymond complained for a while, he realized that he hadn't gotten an answer yet, so he looked over to see what was going on. At Novel Benedet. He was instantly startled. "Fuck, what are you doing? Stop, quick." When Raymond glanced over, he noticed Lin Yun shaking a test tube that contained a thick, red liquid inside. It was definitely red coral solution. When Raymond saw this, he immediately paled in fright. Red coral solution was known to be very unstable. High temperature or agitation could make it emit fierce magic fluctuations, and those were very frightening. The effect was completely disproportionate to the cheap price of the red coral. If such a thing happened, then let alone this laboratory, even all of Gilded Rose might be leveled. That was a destructive power that eluded the control of the mages. It was dangerous, powerful, and unpredictable. Over thousands of years, who knew how many people had tried to take advantage of that power? Countless sages fell one after the other, hoping to grasp that explosive power within their hands. But regretfully, the red coral was a problem that nobody had managed to solve, despite countless efforts in the past millennia. Those fallen sages either died or became disabled after their accidents. In the last 100 years, the red coral solution had even become a taboo of alchemy. Any alchemy apprentice would be repeatedly warned by their teacher that there were many ways to handle red coral, but that they absolutely couldn't dissolve it into a solution. Red coral in its solid state could only be considered a mediocre magic material. Compared to typical magic conductors, it could only release weak mana for 2 to 3 days. These two properties made it so that red coral could only be considered a low-tier magic conductor. Moreover, the production of red coral had always been high, and supply often exceeded demand. Thus, the price had always been very low, making it one of the cheapest magic materials in no scent. But once it was dissolved into a solution, knowing all this, the blood drained out of Raymond's voice. He was afraid to physically stop the maniac in case it caused him to drop the test tube, which would be disastrous. His voice even shook as he repeated, "Didn't you hear? I told you to stop." "Fuck, what are you doing?" Raymond's words were cut short because after that scoundrel was done shaking the test tube, he went even further to court death by igniting a small lamp and holding the test tube above the flame. "If I don't stop him, it'll definitely cause a disaster." Thinking of the frightening explosion that could erupt from the red coral solution, sweat dripped down from Raymond's forehead. Raymond instantly cast a frost spell, putting great effort into shortening the incantation and the somatic component, which sharply increased the consumption of mana. In a flash, a third of the mana within Raymond's body was used up. To a mage, this was like losing half his life. But that would be better than losing his whole life. After consuming so much mana, the speed and power of the frost spell were far greater than usual. Almost at the same time that the spell was cast, the empty laboratory was filled with a bone-piercing chill. It was immediately followed by a spiraling blue light, and the lamp was extinguished. And that wasn't all. After the lamp stopped burning, that blue light seemed to spread crazily like grasping vines. It reached out to the test tube of red coral solution and Lin Yun's right hand, freezing it all in place. Fortunately, nothing happened. Raymond was still shaking as he wiped his cold sweat. That scene had been far too frightening. If it had been a few seconds too late, the entire alchemy laboratory might have already exploded. That scoundrel is too reckless. It doesn't matter if you want to play with red coral, but don't involve me. After getting over the sudden fright, Raymond was completely filled with shock and anger. In fact, with Raymond's level of magical ability, he could have controlled the frost spell to only extinguish the lamp and freeze the test tube, without freezing Lin Yun's hand. That's right, Raymond had done that deliberately. This scoundrel doesn't know what he is doing. It'll be a good lesson for him. Since he still thought that Lin Yun was a magic apprentice, he would never think of treating him as a fellow mage. If not for that scoundrel's relationship with his old man, how could he even care to look at a magic apprentice that was so heavily in debt, let alone one that would try to order him around? If it were anyone else, they would have already been turned into an ice statue by Raymond. I have endured enough of this bullshit. Raymond had already thought about it when casting the frost spell. He would let that scoundrel freeze for an hour, and only then would he mercifully rescue him while strictly admonishing him at the time. Hopefully, this would make that wretch behave himself. And if his father asked, he would justify everything by emphasizing the dangerous nature of the red coral solution. He wasn't lying, after all. Red coral solution really was that dangerous. He did all this for the safety of young Master Merlin. The more Raymond thought about getting to let off some steam, the more cheerful he got. It was to the point that he didn't even notice that Lin Yun was completely unfazed by what had happened. With what Lin Yun had experienced at the end of the magic era, an attack like a frost spell could hardly fluster him. What's more, that frost could hardly be considered an attack. Raymond hadn't thought of Lin Yun as a fellow mage and definitely wouldn't expect that he was a freak that had only needed a few minutes to form a mana whirlpool. Raymond might have been a mage longer than Lin Yun, but when it came to their levels of power, the two were simply not on the same level. Facing Raymond's mana-charged frost, Lin Yun didn't even use a spell to counter it. He only controlled the mana whirlpool within his body to form a thin layer of mana to act as a shield. That mana shield was definitely rough because it didn't have any elemental arrangement. It was just an accumulation of mana. If it had been done by another mage of their time, that frost spell might have been able to just overpower the shield and freeze it out of existence. But it was clear that Lin Yun wasn't an ordinary mage. Surviving for over 20 years at the end of the magic era let Lin Yun accumulate knowledge that far surpassed what was known in this era. Moreover, the finesse and precision of his casting also were exemplary. This sort of casting ability was unrelated with ranks themselves. It was the result of Lin Yun's sweat and tears. In the no-sin of this era, there wasn't any mage that was more familiar with the usage of magic for battle than Lin Yun. continuously fleeing from the sand beast's claws, always living on the edge, always hunting, always being hunted. All this made Lin Yun develop a beast-like instinct. He didn't even need to think to know of the most mana-efficient way to kill his opponent. Just like this mana shield, it seemed rather rough and brittle, but Lin Yun was able to block Raymond's frost spell with it. Not too weak, not too strong, just enough to do the job. Just as the icy mist dissipated, the mana shield's mana also depleted. The thick layer of ice seemed to have frozen Lin Yun's right hand, but it only froze over the mana shield. When the mana of both sides depleted, the mana shield faded away, and Lin Yun only lightly shook his hand for the large sprawl of ice to fall down with a crash. No way, Raymond's eyes widened. He didn't dare to believe what he had just seen. This. How could this be? How could a magic apprentice's body resist a frost spell? Even a mage can't. Although frost is a control-type spell which had never been particularly high in firepower, it is still a second-rank spell. To use his flesh to resist a second-rank spell, even a bold mage wouldn't dare to do so. And that scoundrel not only dared to do so, but he even succeeded. No way, there must be a problem here. Yeah, even if that scoundrel is very weird, he is still Lochmerlin's son. During the flashing god chamber of Commerce's peak, just the word wealthy was not enough to describe it. Lochmerlin's dear only son. Even the alchemy workshop is under his name. How could he not have prepared a few alchemy items for him? And not just alchemy items, he could even have a magic tool. It was definitely a defensive magic tool that blocked the frost spell. Yeah, definitely. Otherwise, how could that scoundrel be totally unharmed after being hit by a frost spell? Such a miscalculation. If he had thought about it earlier, he definitely wouldn't have used frost. After all, it was only a control spell with limited power. It would have been better to use a spell with burst power like Flame Burst. Even if that fellow had a magic tool that could resist magic, he definitely would not have had such an easy time stopping it. Just a shockwave from Flame Burst would be enough to leave him cutting a sorry figure on all fours. The stress had apparently gotten to Raymond, making him forget the reason for casting frost in the first place. At it, novel Benedet. Okay, this was a bit unexpected, but using Flame Burst will fix it. Raymond used a few words to comfort himself before chanting the incantation for Flame Burst, full of confidence. Raymond appeared very calm this time. He shortened neither the incantation nor the spell gestures this time, and just resolutely chanted his spell. Even the arrangement of the elements spinning in his mana whirlpool was textbook, to the point that if a strict teach saw his spell, they wouldn't find any faults. There won't be anything unexpected this time, Raymond thought complacently. But the result was, before Raymond even finished casting, a sharp whistling sound suddenly passed by his ear. That whistle felt like something was ripping through the air. It was followed by Raymond feeling his shoulder tingle before his whole body was sent flying like a cannonball. Raymond landed on the ground a few meters away. At that time, Raymond felt a painful heat on his shoulder and connected it to that sharp sound he'd heard a second ago. Raymond realized that this was the second-rank spell, Tornado Whip, but recognizing it didn't mean that he understood. In fact, after he noticed that it was Tornado Whip, Raymond was even more confused. What happened? How could a tornado whip appear here? For a moment, Raymond even thought that he had chanted the wrong spell, mistaking Flame Burst chant for that of Tornado Whip, causing him to receive backlash from the misfire. If that wasn't the reason, the only possibility was that it had been cast by this apprentice. But the situation quickly changed. Raymond didn't have time to get up before a sharp whistle echoed once again. He felt his other shoulder go numb this time before he went sailing through the air. That's not it. Raymond lay on the ground once again in a state of complete bewilderment. He didn't cast anything this time. So how could another tornado whip appear? No way is it. As he gradually gathered his thoughts, Raymond raised his face and slowly paled. Even a lousy mage couldn't cast two completely wrong spells in a row like that, let alone having the same backlash twice. The only reasonable explanation was that those two spells truly came from that 9th-rank magic apprentice. No, not a ninth-rank magic apprentice. The two spells that came from that guy were clearly both silent and quickened. Damn, that scoundrel is an actual mage, a mage who has mastered at least 2 types of metamagic. At this time, Raymond really wanted to find a hole to hide in. You could have just said that you were a mage. Why did you have to pretend to be a magic apprentice? And did you even need to use Tornado Whip on me twice? Are you a psycho? Raymond really couldn't understand it all. When did Lin Yun break through to become a mage? He was clearly a 9th-rank magic apprentice just a month ago, so how could he suddenly become a mage? And a mage that could easily use 2 metamagic abilities, how heaven-defying was that? How could you have become a mage? Why not? Lin Yun looked at Raymond strangely, not explaining anything. He only casually continued, "Oh right, don't forget to thank your father once we return." What do you mean? Raymond froze when he heard that. But Lin Yun didn't plan to answer. In fact, if not for Lin Yun thinking of that old man who was quite worthy of respect, Raymond would have already turned into a corpse the instant he cast that frost spell. With the vigilance and alertness he cultivated for 20 years at the end of the magic era, how could he even let Raymond cast his shortened cast spell that still needed spell gestures? The moment that the mana fluctuation had appeared, Lin Yun had instantly formed an icicle spell in his hand. If it went as he predicted, once the frost spell was released and the mana whirlpool shrank, Lin Yun would cast his icicle and pierce Raymond's head with it. It was as Lin Yun had said. Raymond really should thank his old man. Just as the icicle was about to be cast, Lin Yun suddenly realized that this wasn't the dog-eat-dog era that he had lived in for so long. The other side's attack wasn't aiming at killing him. Moreover, that young mage's father was a worthy man. Thus, Lin Yun held back the icicle spell and used a rough mana shield to block the frost. "All right, come help me." It was the same commanding tone, but this time, Raymond didn't dare to disregard his words. It wasn't a good idea to refuse a mage that could casually cast 2 tornado whips. If they fought, Raymond would definitely be the one that would suffer a loss. Thus, Raymond had no choice but to keep it in. What I need to do? Enchant those. Lin Yun was busily refining with one hand while using his other hand to point at a few glass bottles. Enchanting was the easiest task in alchemy. It wasn't hard at all for a mage like Raymond. In fact, every mage had studied alchemy to some extent, some more than others. There were many high-ranked mages who were peak alchemists. Since the birth of alchemy, it had been linked in countless ways to magic. They complemented each other. If one wanted to walk far in the world of magic, it would be impossible without the help of alchemy. Alchemy equipment could bring about direct improvements in power. Refined potions could replenish strength in times of need. Puppets created through alchemy had even greater strategic uses. If a mage didn't have the support of alchemy, even if he was a unique genius, his accomplishments would be limited. It was the same for alchemy, which was also linked inevitably to magic. A good mage wasn't necessarily a good alchemist, but a good alchemist was bound to be a good mage. This might sound a bit strange, but it was a well-known fact. Some complicated alchemy formulas needed a deep and wide understanding of magic. Some people might rely on talent and hard work to have some achievements in alchemy, but only a mage could keep researching deeper and deeper. Without enough knowledge of magic, one wouldn't be able to understand those complex alchemy formulas. Without enough skill with metamagic, one would never be able to make their own magic tool. Raymond's achievements in alchemy couldn't be considered very high, and he was still very far from being able to make his own magic tool. But there was no problem with enchanting a few glass bottles. Raymond started enchanting the bottle, skillfully and casually, while still wondering how this scoundrel had become mage. What's that smell? While Raymond was lost in his thoughts, a strongly irritating smell assaulted his nostrils. Raymond first frowned with annoyance before suddenly paling. Raymond realized that the person at the alchemy table next to him had put a flame rock into that test tube. Shit! Raymond held his breath. If a flame rock was stimulated with magic power, it would instantly reach a high temperature. Throwing that thing in a red coral solution was like throwing fire on a pile of fireworks. Doomed! This scoundrel really will kill us this time. As the flame rock fell into the test tube, a red light burst out, and Raymond could already feel the high temperature from his location. Raymond wanted to curse, but it was too late. Under the high temperature, the red coral solution was already out of control. The berserk mana was wreaking havoc as the red light soared, dyeing the entire laboratory in a bloody crimson light. A surge of red bubbles was striving to rush out of the test tube. Feeling the horrible mana fluctuations, Raymond closed his eyes, resigned to his fate. We are screwed. The peaceful alchemy laboratory was so quiet that time seemed to have been frozen, and only the sound of the bubbles in the test tube could be heard. Raymond cringed back and waited for a long time, waiting for his last moments to arrive. But after waiting for a long time, he suddenly heard a voice. "What are you doing?" When Raymond, who had been waiting for his death with his eyes closed, heard this voice, he initially thought it was just his imagination. But then he thought about it. Would there be such an annoying voice right after I entered the afterlife? Thus, Raymond opened his eyes and looked over. That scoundrel, who should have been buried in a magic explosion already, was standing there as if nothing had happened. He was still holding that frightening test tube in his hand. But at that time, Raymond didn't focus on the test tube at all. Instead, he was wondering why there hadn't been an explosion or even anything out of place at all. Why? The red coral solution should have already gone out of control due to the high temperature. So how could it remain completely unagitated within the test tube? Raymond's mind was in a total mess, as if it was melting. No problems had arisen when the red coral solution was heated to a high temperature, which was something that Raymond couldn't accept. This was simply like shaming Raymond's knowledge of alchemy. And Auckland's alchemy professors had emphasized many times that red coral shouldn't be dissolved into a solution no matter what, let alone having it come into contact with high temperatures. If he had to choose between this being his own misunderstanding or his professors making such a huge mistake, he would rather believe that everything he had just seen was only a figment of his imagination. Indeed, as if to prove that everything wasn't just an illusion, that really annoying voice echoed once again, and moreover, it seemed quite impatient this time. How long could it possibly take to enchant a few glass bottles? As he said that, Lin Yun came over, still holding his test tube that was filled with the red coral solution. "You, don't come." Raymond jumped back in fear. He subconsciously wanted to stop him, but he soon recovered and immediately changed his tone. "I'll bring them to you." Raymond felt a bit regretful after saying that. Doing someone's dirty work without profiting from it and still having to bring it to them afterwards. This was losing one's pride, but he had already spoken these words and couldn't take them back. Thus, Raymond could only suffer in silence and finish the last enchantment before enduring the shame and bringing those few glass bottles to that scoundrel. At novel Benedette. In order to retain a bit of pride, Raymond put the bottles down on the alchemy table one after the other and was going to snort coldly to show his displeasure. But as he caught sight of that deep red test tube again, he didn't keep up the act in the slightest due to his worry. He looked at Lin Yun, feeling rather angry but not daring to speak. Lin Yun didn't bother about him at all as he took the enchanted bottles and arranged them on the table before pouring the red coral solution into the glass bottles, giving each a precisely even portion. During the entire process, Raymond's eyelids couldn't help twitching. After he was done with all this, Lin Yun finally put the dangerous test tube down and began to sift through the pile of low-cost magic materials, organizing them. He then ground some dried thousand-knot flowers, used a filtering cup to extract the juice of 7 leaves grass, and spread a bit of moonlight sand on a white sheet of paper. After a few simple incantations, the scattered sand began shining gently. The radiance gradually became increasingly more dazzling, and Lin Yun started working faster. The juice of the 7 leaves grass was poured into the glass bottles, and the diluted red coral solution's red radiance dimmed. When the powdered thousand-knot flower was added in, the irritating smell slowly disappeared. When the glow of the moonlight sand disappeared, the 3 bottles of light red liquid revealed their true appearance through a faint mist. My God! After Raymond saw all of this, although he had still been regretting his loss of pride before, he slowly opened his mouth wide, a sluggish expression appearing on his face. He was completely stunned as he looked at Lin Yun with fear, as if this person before him was actually a monster. How could this be a colorful potion? Raymond clearly remembered that a few months ago, when he had just broken through and become a mage, the magic school allowed him to enter Auckland's laboratory to study for a week as a reward. There, he learned about a whole new world. That place could be considered the learning center of the kingdom. There were 2 archmages as well as 7 great alchemists. It was even said that the one who was truly in charge of Auckland's laboratory was a master alchemist. Their existences made Auckland's laboratory a holy land in the hearts of countless alchemists. When Raymond visited, he had really felt like he was making a pilgrimage. That week was like a dream for Raymond. Being in the central hub of learning and having the chance to see those legendary existences, while even getting to hear them discuss their work if he was lucky. Furthermore, he occasionally was able to watch their research. To Raymond, this experience was worth all the wealth he could ever earn in his lifetime. There weren't many people that could get an opportunity like Raymond's. Whether it was an archmage or a great alchemist, they were all people standing at the peak of their domains. They were somewhat already separated from the common folk, and they could unconsciously say something that might very well enlighten mages like Raymond and save them years of fumbling their way forward. Raymond still remembered the afternoon of the 3rd day that he was there. He had been fortunate enough to have the chance to spectate great alchemist Gustav's potion making. He was creating a bottle of colorful potion, specialized in cleansing away a mana whirlpool's impurities. For a mage that was already standing at the peak of the standard mage level and urgently wanted to shatter their mana whirlpool to step into the great mage stage, the value of that colorful potion simply couldn't be calculated. This was a miracle of alchemy. After witnessing the miracle personally, Raymond felt that every detail was worth cherishing. The young mage felt that even if 10 years passed, he would still remember everything that had happened there. And nowhere near 10 years had passed. So Raymond's current understanding was even clearer. Perhaps it was because of this vivid memory, but Raymond seemed to lose control. Regarding the 3 bottles on the alchemy table, whether it was the smell emanating from them or their magic fluctuations, it was all exactly the same as that colorful potion. What did that mean? It meant that this person who had been stuck as a mere apprentice for a few years wasn't just a mage who had mastered 2 kinds of spellcasting abilities, but he was also a very gifted alchemist. I must be dreaming, right? As a mage, Raymond naturally knew that regardless of whether it was magic or alchemy, they all required a great amount of time and experience. Being gifted in these 2 domains wouldn't decisively change that fact. No matter how outstanding and gifted someone was, they would need time to gather knowledge and temper their skills. No one could skip this process. Among the numerous branches of alchemy, potioneering was the one that consumed the most time. With the large numbers of formulas and never-ending testing, all the potion alchemists had grown through countless failures. So up to now in the Anlusa Kingdom, the youngest potion alchemist was at least 30 years old. This was already the limit. Without at least that much time to gather knowledge and experience, it was simply impossible to become an alchemist. But that young Master Merlin was only 20 this year. He was shockingly young if his accomplishments here were real. If he truly was a potion alchemist at this age, then he was bound to become a great alchemist. I just attacked a future great alchemist. As this thought came to mind, cold sweat dripped down Raymond's forehead. This wasn't a joke. How about I take the initiative and apologize first before asking for forgiveness in a sincere tone? Although this sounded like throwing away his pride, after offending someone that would gain such incredible status, there was no other choice. He had already lowered himself anyway, so there wouldn't be much of a loss if he lowered himself more. Right, let's do this. Thus, Raymond began racking his mind to decide the best way to proceed. Since it was necessary to throw aside his pride, it would be better to think about how to do it. As a result, Raymond had yet to come up with anything good when Lin Yun's work was already complete. The alchemy table had been neatly cleaned away, and the few tools that had been used were back in their places, including the crucible that had been picked out from a trash can. This was a habit that Lin Yun picked up from living at the end of the magic era. In that era, which was so deficient in resources, Even a crystal the size of a grain of rice would be a huge treasure. After living a life in that poor environment, Lin Yun simply wouldn't put up with any wasteful actions. Let's go. After finishing, Lin Yun took the 3 potions and left the alchemy laboratory. Lin Yun's words snapped Raymond out of his intense introspection about his pride, and after getting his bearings, the young mage mumbled, "Yes," but before leaving, he seemed to recall something. If he wasn't wrong, when young Master Merlin cleaned the alchemy table, he seemed to have thrown the test tube used for the red coral solution into the incinerator. Although he had already seen with his own eyes that the flame rock didn't cause the red coral solution to erupt earlier, he still had those teachings stuck in his mind. He began to ask, "That red coral solution? Don't worry, there will be no issue." Before Raymond had even asked anything, Lin Yun had already answered. Lin Yun knew what was troubling Raymond, which was whether the remnants of the red coral solution would explode in the incinerator. It wouldn't, of course. How much longer would it take before alchemists were able to find out that the problem of red coral solution going violently out of control when heated or agitated wasn't something unsolvable? A bit of moonlight sand and a short incantation was enough to fix that problem. When that time came, the discovery would change the way that alchemy was taught. A great number of new techniques would emerge, and countless alchemists would be deeply immersed in studying the red coral solution. They would make use of the incredible amount of magic contained inside to make countless shocking achievements in the field. And among these were the 3 spectrum potions in Lin Yun's pocket. That's right, these weren't colorful potions, they were spectrum potions. Naturally, Raymond wasn't completely wrong in his assessment. The scent and magic fluctuations of the spectrum potion were the same as those of the colorful potion, and even the effects weren't totally different. Though, even if they were similar, they weren't completely the same. After all, the added effect of the red coral solution was a game changer. The only use of the colorful potion was to purify the mana whirlpool. There was no need to use a dangerous material that was full of mana like the red coral solution for this. Only the spectrum potion had this kind of mana requirement. Even if the spectrum potion could also purify the mana whirlpool, the main effect was to strengthen the mana whirlpool. After bathing in the glow of the moonlight sand, the red coral solution's mana was even more stable. Adding the 1,000-knot flowers made it so that the mana could be absorbed by mages. Although absorbing the mana seemed difficult and would need a large amount of time, it was extremely valuable. Even the worst mage would be able to understand. What a mage yearned for most. It was definitely the chance to strengthen their mana whirlpool. As long as they had a mana whirlpool that was strong enough, a mage could be nearly omnipotent. And the spectrum potion offered that possibility. Despite it not being as good at purifying the mana whirlpool as the colorful potion, there were no other alternatives for strengthening the mana whirlpool, so the spectrum potion was bound to be worth more than the colorful potion, especially for the mages that had yet to reach 9th rank. They weren't in a hurry to purify their mana whirlpools and were still trying to just strengthen them as much as possible. They were the true targets for the sale of the spectrum potion. Moreover, there were far more of those mages than the ones at 9th rank who were on the verge of breaking through. "All right, Raymond, help me with something." Help." Raymond was still a bit dazed and subconsciously expressed his confusion, but he immediately reacted and corrected himself. That the 20-year-old alchemist, he is someone that can trample my pride anytime. I can't offend him. I really can't offend him. Thus, Raymond hurriedly answered with a smile, "Please tell me what to do." Unfortunately for him, Lin Yun didn't pay attention to the fact that Raymond was addressing him so politely for the first time. He only took the 3 potions from his pocket and said, "Help me deliver these potions. This bottle is for the Victorious Return Main Street's auction house. Tell them that I need it sold within 3 days, and let them decide the price. This potion is for the Mage Guild. I need a library pass with the highest privileges. As for the remaining potion, do as you wish. Add it novel Bennett at. Okay, auction house, Mage Guild, me. As I wish. Yes, as you wish, you can decide. If you want to drink it or give it away, do as you wish." The hand that was holding the spectrum potions suddenly shook, and he nearly dropped the potions. These are spectrum potions. Besides purifying the mana whirlpool, it can also strengthen the mana whirlpool. I see that you should be a 5th rank mage, so drinking this should be very beneficial. Isn't this too precious? Raymond hadn't expected that the last bottle of potion would actually be given to himself. It turned out that this wasn't the colorful potion that he'd thought it was, but just by listening to the description of its effects, he could tell that this potion was a treasure among treasures. Purifying and strengthening the mana whirlpool at the same time, either of these two effects was something that every mage longed for. Yet this did both at the same time. Considering that Raymond had just been thinking about how he should curry favor with Lin Yun, this was a bit too much. He originally thought that since he had attacked a future great alchemist, even if he didn't die, he would still be in a precarious situation. He had already been trying to figure out how to resolve this issue. Yet in the end, after leaving the Gilded Rose, a pie fell from the sky, leaving Raymond feeling confused and stunned. Even after a long time, he still didn't know what to do. Okay, hurry up and take care of it. Gifting a bottle of Spectrum Potion wasn't that big of a deal to Lin Yun, so he didn't take it to heart. Only in the current era would a Spectrum Potion be regarded as precious, because no technique to handle red coral solution had appeared yet. However, that technique was nothing secret later on, and red coral could be seen everywhere in this era. As long as Lin Yun wanted, he could make dozens of Spectrum Potions, so giving out just one potion as a reward was just being polite. Raymond had helped him with enchanting the bottles, so he gave him a Spectrum Potion as a reward. It was that simple. As for what Raymond thought, Lin Yun truly didn't have the time to care about it. After seeing the world end with his own eyes just a short while ago, he had inexplicably ended up in an unfamiliar body. With such an exciting and satisfying experience, he still hadn't fully recovered from it. How could he care about what sorts of social intrigue others were thinking? Raymond did his work efficiently, and on the 3rd day at noon, the bell of the Merlin family house resounded. After explaining to his father why he had disappeared for 2 days, he went upstairs to Lin Yun's room. This is the 30,000 gold from the sale of the Spectrum Potion at the auction house. Raymond handed a crystal card over, some regret showing on his face. Unfortunately, time was too tight. The auction house didn't have enough time to spread the information about the item. It could only reach the ears of the mages in Thousand Sails City, so in the end, an 8th rank mage bought it. The auction staff said that if they had a few more days, they could definitely have sold this Spectrum Potion for at least 50,000 gold. 30,000 is enough. Lin Yun shook his head. Whether it was 30,000 or 50,000, each was the same in his eyes. Indeed, Lin Yun was in need of money, but just tens of thousands was really too little. What Lin Yun wanted to do wasn't something that could be accomplished with a few tens of thousand gold, or even hundreds of thousands. But 30,000 gold would be enough for their immediate daily expenses. For Lin Yun, the first thing he needed to do was to get a better understanding of this time period. Mafa Merlin was only a magic apprentice, so he only knew things up to that level. He had no understanding of the higher realms. His understanding of this world through his memories was too limited to begin with. Thus, Lin Yun was even more concerned about the whereabouts of the second Spectrum Potion. What about the Mage Guild? The Mage Guild. Raymond had still been feeling regretful about the loss of 20,000 gold. Upon hearing Lin Yun's words, he remembered something and fished out a second crystal card from his bag. It went very smoothly with the Mage Guild. I found a senior working there, and the higher-ups expressed their approval. But they asked something. They would like for you to visit them when you have time. There will be an opportunity for that. Lin Yun put away the 2 crystal cards, not expressing a clear refusal to the Mage Guild's proposition. Since he wanted to access the Mage Guild's library, there was no way he could choose not to meet them. Rather than having someone inquiring, it was better to meet them openly to see what they wanted. Good. I'll go give the answer to my senior. Wait a bit. I still need your help with something. Again, Raymond almost spat out. After running around with the Spectrum Potions these past few days, how could Raymond not know of their true worth? That time, the auction house had disturbed their chief alchemist to have him personally appraise that potion. The Mage Guild even bothered one of their 3 big shots, someone that would rarely appear in public, but he did come out to personally receive a mere 5th rank mage. And for what? Out of respect for the Spectrum Potion. And Raymond had one of these incredibly precious alchemy potions, and he only got it by helping with enchanting a few glass bottles. Now that he was being asked to help once again, Raymond was naturally very willing to do so. He was yearning to be of use to Lin Yun. What do I need to do? I need some magic materials. This is the list. Can you see if you can help me with it? Lin Yun asked as he passed it over to Raymond. After finishing the Spectrum Potions, Lin Yun had not gone out. He had been very dissatisfied by the efficacy of his 2 tornado whips. Whether it was power or accuracy, they were both miles apart from what he had been capable of in the past. Lin Yun even doubted whether those spells had been cast by him. But after thinking about it, that Mafa Merlin had been stuck as an apprentice for so long, which made it make more sense. He had very poor innate talent. Whether it was sustaining mana or controlling it, his ability was far below average. This could already be considered a flawed body. Hard work and diligence could only make the accumulated mana stronger, but he couldn't overcome his body's flaws and advance to become a true mage. Naturally, after Lin Yun arrived, he relied on his mana control that far surpassed that of others of this era and used a method that could be considered rough and simple to advance to the mage realm. But this was only because the master of the body was now Lin Yun, not because the problem of this body had been settled. The problem was far from being resolved. Although the mana whirlpool had already smoothly taken shape, in the future, from mage to great mage, from great mage to high mage, and from high mage to archmage, each time he would have to break through, this body's flaws would cause Lin Yun further complications. If he didn't solve that problem early on, Lin Yun would suffer from it sooner or later. In this era, when the research on the subject hadn't matured enough yet, this kind of physical defect was equivalent to being cut off from the path of mages. If one couldn't even sustain a slightly more intense mana flow, how could one become a qualified mage? Fortunately for him, Lin Yun didn't belong to this era. Solving the problem of mana sustenance wasn't a problem, as Lin Yun had at least 2 ways. One used a special meditation technique to change the pattern of his mana flow, but the time needed for this method wasn't insignificant. Lin Yun wouldn't be able to advance to become a great mage for at least 3 to 5 years if he went down that path. The second one was using an alchemy potion to strengthen one's body. This method was a lot faster, 10 days at best, 15 at worst, but compared to 3 to 5 years, it was negligible. Naturally, the cost of this method would be enormous. Many magic materials could be described as precious even in this era, and the 30,000 gold in Lin Yun's hands was far from enough. But it wasn't urgent. Lin Yun estimated that he should have a good amount of time before advancing to Great Mage. So during that time, he would get a better understanding of this world. After getting another opportunity to help, Raymond simply couldn't wait. There wasn't even enough time to relax, as the rest of his 10-day vacation wouldn't be enough to finish this. He hurriedly hugged the potion bottle and ran out, making the old butler shake his head with a lonely expression. He sighed, muttering to himself that his son had grown up and was no longer willing to stay and keep his old man company. Indeed, he isn't very filial. You should beat him up next time he returns. Lin Yun had no issue slandering Raymond as he prepared to go to the Mage Guild. The Mage Guild was also on the victorious return Main Street. It was only 2 crossroads away from the Gilded Rose, and one could see the Sage Tower reaching into the sky. The runes carved on the tower were always flickering, and even when the sun was shining down, they would still be covered in that mysterious, dazzling light. Lin Yun stood underneath the tower, sizing up the runes carved on its exterior while waiting for the guard to inspect his pass. From the runes carved on the tower should have been built in an era that wasn't peaceful, because those runes were mostly used in battles between armies, at least on the scale of tens of thousands. Moreover, from the mana flow of the runes, they had definitely been used more than once. Rather than a tower, it was more suitable to call that place a stronghold. Welcome to the Sage Tower. When he saw the golden magic symbol on the crystal card, the guard immediately stood at attention and his tone became much more respectful. This symbol meant that the bearer had the highest privileges and was free to read any book in the Sage Tower's library. In the entire Thousand Sails city, only 7 people had that privilege. Every one of them was a figure at the peak of their field. He wasn't someone a small guard like him could neglect. "Thanks." Lin Yun recovered the inspected pass and smiled at the respectful guard before entering the millennium-old magic hall. If one could say that the Sage Tower was the Thousand Sails city's palace of magic, then the Sage Tower's library was definitely the treasure room. It had the richest collection of books of all kinds in the kingdom's east. Countless sages had left their prints here, and every year, countless mages went to the trouble of traveling across long distances to come here and enter the Sage Tower's library, even if it was just to stand inside foolishly for a long time. To mages, knowledge was like a drug, and their thirst for knowledge surpassed everything. In the Lashan area, many mages would pay huge sums that ordinary people couldn't even imagine just to get a pass to the Sage Tower's library, and without any regrets. Naturally, Lin Yun held the highest pass, so he didn't have this kind of feeling. Slowly going up a delicately decorated flight of steps, he would sometimes brush past a few hurrying mages, and before long, Lin Yun stood outside the library on the 18th floor of the Sage Tower. At it Novel Benedet, the library was very peaceful. Looking from outside, one could see many black-gowned silhouettes sitting down at various desks. They would rarely talk among each other, and even when they had no other choice but to talk, they would whisper very quietly to the point that Lin Yun, who stood at the entrance, couldn't hear anything except the rustling noise of the pages being flipped. Truly a good reading environment. Lin Yun entered the library and tried to not make a sound. He found an empty desk leaning against the wall and set his pass down to show that he had taken this spot. However, when he was about to go look for a book, a young black-gowned mage sat in front of him. When that young mage sat down, he put the 3 books in his hands onto the desk with some force, letting out a loud thud. Lin Yun, who had just gotten up, couldn't help frowning as he gave the other mage a strange look. "What, Merlin forgot me that fast?" The young mage seemed to be around 25 years old, and he could be considered quite handsome, but his current expression was very disagreeable. Thus, Lin Yun couldn't help frowning after seeing him. But this young mage wasn't Raymond. If Raymond saw Lin Yun frown, he would definitely shut up. Ever since that day in the Gilded Rose where Lin Yun almost killed him, Lin Yun had only frowned once, and now he had frowned twice. The one who had just come up didn't seem to understand the meaning behind the frown. Lin Yun's frown was clearly unhappy, and he actually didn't seem to remember him at all. But that guy exaggeratedly continued. "We saw each other last month. How could you forget me so quickly? Being that forgetful isn't good. I'm Mason. I beat your nose to a bloody pulp at last month's Chambers of Commerce Union gathering. That Mason." Mason? Lin Yun carefully thought back through his newfound memories and discovered that there was really such a person, and he had left a deep impression. According to Mafa's memories, this Mason fellow also came from a merchant family. His father was Mon Shi, the president of one of the 7 great chambers of commerce of Thousand Sails City, the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce. As a matter of fact, the status of the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce was even higher than that of the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce among the 7. After all, the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce had only risen up in the last few decades, while the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce had already established itself for a millennium, and its true power was far stronger than what it showed. It was just that the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce had risen too quickly these past decades, outshining the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce to the point that almost everyone believed that the #1 Chamber of Commerce in Thousand Sails City was the one headed by the Merlins. Coincidentally, Mason and Mafa both became magic apprentices later on, while the 2 major chambers of commerce were fighting, both openly and covertly. Naturally, many busybodies started comparing the 2 of them, but that comparison stopped after a few months, because Mason managed to advance and became a mage. Afterwards, at a meeting of the 7 chambers of commerce, Mason found an excuse to ruthlessly teach a lesson to Mafa. As he had just said, he had beaten Mafa's nose into a bloody pulp. That created a large conflict between the 2 chambers of commerce. If not for Loch Merlin having an accident at sea, Who knew what would have happened? Had it novel been it at? This was definitely not a good memory for Maffa Merlin. It could even be considered a great humiliation. But for Lin Yun, who had witnessed the end of the world, this was really not worthy of his attention. A 9th-rank magic apprentice and a 1st-rank mage that relied on alchemy potions to advance. Lin Yun felt like their struggles were similar to kids playing house. Thus, Lin Yun didn't even bat an eye and only nodded, expressing his understanding before turning to leave his desk for the first bookshelf in front of him and focusing on what he had been looking for. Soon, Lin Yun found what he needed, a thick book entitled No Scent History. Lin Yun grabbed it and started slowly flipping through the pages. Lin Yun was so focused and conscientious in his studying that he didn't even notice that Mason had already come over. TSK, let me see that. No Scent History? No way, it's really No Scent History. Ha ha ha. Merlin, you magic apprentices are really strange. As he said this, Mason's laughter grew even more exaggerated. How much money did your Merlin family spend to send you here? And you don't even cherish this opportunity. This is the Sage Tower's library. Even if you don't understand those books, you can still get some insights from them if you try hard enough. There is no need to put on an act and read children's books. TSK. No Scent History. I would feel embarrassed for you if people saw you with that cover showing. With an exaggerated double take, Mason continued. All right, I forgot to ask. Didn't the flashing gold chamber of commerce go bankrupt? How could your family still have money? If I were you, I would repay the debts first before spending money. I heard that a few days ago, your uncle Ferio took a contract to your house to ask for money. How about I ask my father to lend you some gold for you to repay him first? At first, Lin Yun didn't pay attention to him, but Mason kept on talking. The more he talked, the more excited he became, as he had no intention of letting Lin Yun off. Lin Yun finally frowned for the 3rd time. Manager. Lin Yun's voice wasn't loud, but it echoed for a bit in this peaceful library and seemed abnormally lofty, to the point that many reading mages couldn't help glancing over, some curious and some annoyed. As for the library manager, a 30-year-old 9th-rank mage, he slowly came over from a doorway. What? As the manager made his way over, his demeanor showed that he was clearly annoyed. He had chosen to become the manager of the library because this place was quiet, so he could ponder over his work or other issues without being disturbed. But now he was being bothered by 2 kids in their 20s, so it would be strange if he was in a good mood. I would like to file a complaint against Mage Mason here. He is excessively trying to chat me up and has already affected my reading experience. So I hope that the library staff can keep him as far as possible from me. Mage Mason, is this the case? Regardless of the reason, directly disturbing others from reading was absolutely not allowed in the Sage Tower's library. Thus, the 9th-rank mage looked at Mason with a severe expression. No, it's not like that. Mason was suddenly startled. He had spent a lot of his father's money to be able to enter the Sage Tower's library. It would definitely be too unfair if he was kicked out now because of a few sentences. No good. I have to find an excuse. Mason glanced at Lin Yun and suddenly thought of a plan. So he kept his voice and expression stable as he pointed at Lin Yun. I only was suspecting that he had entered the library through improper means and wanted to question him. He simply doesn't have the qualifications to stand here. He is called Maffa Merlin, the son of Loch Merlin of the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce, a 9th-rank magic apprentice. If I'm not wrong, only 1st-rank mages are qualified to enter the Sage Tower's library. Once these words came out, not to mention the onlookers, even the 9th-rank mage was taken aback for an instant before turning to Lin Yun and inquiring, Mr. Maffa Merlin, can I take a look at your pass? Calling him Mr. and not Mage already showed that Mason's words had had some sort of effect. But that effect instantly disappeared when Lin Yun handed over his pass. The 9th-rank mage casually received the pass and then froze before an appalled expression appeared on his face. Even though he quickly covered it up, when he spoke again, everyone could hear the respect in his words. My apologies, Mage Merlin. I'll properly take care of this matter and give you a satisfactory explanation. After saying that, he respectfully returned the pass with 2 hands as if it was a treasure. You are kidding. The highest privilege pass, and it was issued 2 days ago. What does that mean? 2 days ago, the 3 big shots issued such a pass in the middle of the night. If the mages of the Sage Tower were to learn that the owner of that pass was wronged by the library manager, I would be the first to suffer. It's not necessary. Linya nodded and put the pass into his pocket, picking up the book about Nascent's history once again. Mage Mason, please follow me. On the side, the 9th-rank mage's face was scarily gloomy. Although the words he used to address Mason seemed very polite, just hearing the sinister tone was enough for Mason to feel chill. It was no wonder that the 9th-rank mage felt so resentful of Mason. He truly had been led into a hole by that bastard. You can't just stick to reading when you're in the library. Do you want to cause trouble everywhere? And you even had to provoke someone that alarmed the 3 big shots. It's fine if you're courting death, but why are you involving me? As he stewed in his thoughts, the library manager became more and more upset. I truly only had suspicions. As he was being led away by the 9th-rank mage, Mason was still trying to defend himself. Unfortunately for him, no one wanted to listen to what he was saying anymore. When those two left the library, Lin Yun had already flipped his way through more than half of No-Scent history. This was actually a time transmigration of 30,000 years. Lin Yun slowly closed the book. He didn't need to look at the rest of the contents. If the history he knew of wasn't wrong, the current period should be shortly after the destruction of the Third Dynasty. Mankind had just recently started the era of plane colonization, and there were about 30,000 years left until the eventual destruction of No-Scent. This was a truly great era. Nascent's glorious magic civilization started during the colonization era. Countless resources passed through the colonies and endlessly flew towards No-Scent. The magic civilization expanded at a crazy speed. The power and the ambitions of mages increased accordingly, and the magic system was overturned time and time again. The magic civilization was pushed towards a peak that could never have been imagined before, all the way up until Nascent's mana was exhausted, and the mages that could once be compared to gods fell back to being mortals. The formerly glorious magic civilization dimmed, and the world ended up being swallowed in flames and darkness. Of course, all this had yet to happen. Lin Yun put No-Scent history back on the shelf, and then took a book on the Gilded formula. From his book, he could see that the Sage Tower truly had a rich collection. Lin Yun had read about the Gilded formula in that decayed library in the End of Time. That place had been said to contain the last embers of the magic civilization. The books that could be stored there, even in a corner, were definitely quality books among quality books. Naturally, the two versions of the Gilded formula had huge differences. This was normal, since the one that Lin Yun had read about had been refined by countless mages over countless years. It had already been revised close to the point of perfection. Compared to that, the book in his hands could be considered a semi-finished product at best. But to Lin Yun, it didn't matter whether it was only semi-finished or not. He knew the perfected Gilded formula so well that even if he had the finalized version in front of him, it would be a bit of review. What Lin Yun wanted to do with his Gilded formula was to judge the magical knowledge of this era and what kind of level it had reached. This would let Lin Yun better understand the period that he was now in. A book on Nascent's history wasn't enough. In fact, Lin Yun's only knowledge of this era so far was the point in history that he was currently in. Nothing could be done about it. There were a lot of useful things in the end of the world, but that definitely didn't include a detailed record of history. In a world where surviving to the next day wasn't certain, who would want to pay attention to what had happened so long ago in the past? In fact, about 100 years after the mana was exhausted, Nascent's history had been almost completely severed. Lin Yun only knew about some major events that had been passed down by word of mouth through some stories. As for the details, as Lin Yun put it, all the conscientious historians died. Lin Yun sighed and focused his attention back onto the Gilded formula. At that time, someone knocked on the door of the reception room on the top floor of the Sage Tower. 3 people were sitting in the reception room, one old, one middle-aged, and one young. The old one was wearing a gray gown. He had a grizzled beard and thin figure and was issuing a few coughs from time to time, his body seeming to be in poor shape. In comparison, the middle-aged man sitting in front of him seemed a lot more lively, his hair and beard meticulously combed. And although the clothes he wore seemed neither luxurious nor ostentatious, the exquisite clothing was finely handcrafted. A person with a discerning eye would notice that they had been made by a famous tailor. It was highly possible that this set of clothes was worth enough to pay for the expenses of an ordinary family for an entire year. The youth sitting to the side wasn't even 30 years old, but the shocking part was that the cuffs of his black gown had some thin silver lines. In other words, this was a great mage that was less than 30 years old. But in this reception room, whether it was the rich middle-aged man or the young great mage, they both had a very respectful attitude toward the old man. This was because that old man was the leader of Thousand Sail City Mage Guild, one of the 3 big shots of the Sage Tower, Solomon. In Thousand Sail City, the 3 big shots of the Sage Tower were legendary existences. They would rarely appear in public, and in the past few years, almost no one had ever caught sight of them. People only knew that these 3 powerful mages who were jointly controlling the Sage Tower had been on the path of growing as high mages for the past dozen years or so, and that they had deep and unmeasurable strength. Their existences were the sole reason that the Mage Guild towered above Thousand Sail City. No one would challenge the Mage Guild. Who would dare to face the fury of 3 high mages? It would be a joke. It had to be known that they weren't some kind and benevolent elders. Back in the days, the outstanding and vicious bandit group called Blackwing was burnt to ashes by these 3 big shots. That bandit group had consisted of more than 1,000 people, but ultimately, no one was left alive. Come in. The knocking sound had interrupted the discussion between the 3 men. The old man could only smile apologetically at his 2 guests. Had it novel been at President Monshi, Mage Ryan, I'm sorry for the disturbance. The one who opened the door was a young mage that was perhaps almost 30. If Lin Yun were there, he would definitely be able to recognize him at first sight. That young mage had been in the library earlier, and when Mason was taken away, he had thrown a few curious glances at Lin Yun. After entering, the young mage first apologized to the 2 guests before whispering a few words into Solomon's ear. Okay, I understand. After listening to the young mage's report, Solomon merely nodded and did not give the young mage a real response. In fact, he turned towards the 2 guests with an apologetic smile. I'm truly sorry, President Monshi. A problem happened in the library. The library? When Monshi heard that, his eyelids twitched a little. Isn't Mason in the library right now? How could Monshi not know of his son's character? Usually taking advantage of his family's influence, he didn't have any scruples doing anything he wanted. And with Mage Ryan's help, he had recently advanced and become a new mage. Feeling burgeoning pride in his recent success, he became even more arrogant, to the point that at the last gathering of the 7 Chambers of Commerce, he had casually found an excuse to punch Lockmerlin's son, almost creating a huge problem. Currently, he had poured a huge amount of money into drawing up a plan to cooperate with the Sage Tower, sending his son to the library in the meantime, as he had felt that it was less likely to come into conflict with anyone when everyone there was just quietly reading. Before he left, he had specially warned his son that the Sage Tower wasn't just any place. He couldn't act arrogant there, or he would bring a lot of trouble to the family. As he thought of what might have happened, Monshi couldn't help having a headache. Sometimes, he really couldn't understand. They were both his sons, so why was the difference between Mason and Ryan so great? One was steady and shrewd, managing to become a great mage at a young age, while the other was always only stirring up trouble. Even his eventual breakthrough to become a mage had only been accomplished through relying on his older brother. After he returned this time, he would properly discipline Mason. Otherwise, if it kept going, he would bring a great disaster to the family. Monshi hesitated for a while before forcing himself to ask, Leader Solomon, did Mason? Don't mind it. It was a minor issue. Solomon waved his hand, his smile still on his face. A disagreement happened between Mason and a young mage just now in the library. It's not that big of a deal. Solon took care of it. I am truly ashamed. Monshi repeatedly apologized while relaxing somewhat. Hearing Solomon's tone, it seemed that, Thankfully, Mason must not have provoked an important mage of the Sage Tower. If that was the case, giving Solomon a suitable apology and then paying his respects to the Sage Tower should be enough. As for that young mage, it would be better for him to be tactful. If he wanted to get into trouble with someone, he should know who he was talking to. The Manchi family wasn't one to be trifled with. The only thing that mattered now was the attitude of the Sage Tower, but it seemed that there was not much problem with it. After all, he had brought up the cooperation plan, so he should have a lot of sway for the Sage Tower right now. At this crucial moment, Solomon would give him some face despite his son's actions. Just as Manchi expected, Solomon quickly accepted his apologies and didn't talk further about Mason's faults. Afterwards, the discussion continued quite pleasantly and was no longer just limited to business talk. It wasn't so stiff anymore, so the atmosphere in the reception room naturally became more harmonious, sounding more like old friends were talking. Solomon even talked about some of his past experiences. He was someone who had been a high mage for more than a dozen of years, after all. His experiences were legends for many people. Regardless of whether it was the extremely wealthy Manchi or the great mage Ryan who broke through before even reaching 30, they both listened, enraptured, as these stories were an eye-opener to them. When leaving, Solomon surprisingly also accompanied them to the door. This was a rarely seen treatment and was happening for the first time in years. After seeing off the father and son, Solomon returned to the reception room once again. Solon, who had been waiting there the whole time, carefully asked, "Teacher, should I appease Mason?" Solon assumed that since his teacher had talked so happily with this father and son duo for all this time, the Sage Tower and the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce would most likely finalize the cooperation agreement, and the young Mason who had been driven away from the library might need to be appeased. He was Manchi's son after all. If he made too much noise, it might not bring any benefit to the imminent partnership. Solon hadn't expected that after sitting down, the old man would fire off such sharp words. "What do you mean, appease? Get him out of here." What? Causing trouble in a library is definitely an affront to the dignity of the Mage Guild. Not breaking his legs is already letting him off easy. All right, if that Manchi comes to look for me tomorrow, you can tell him that I went to Alana and that I will take 10 days. No, I should come back in a month. Solon didn't even know how to react to this. What's happening? Didn't teacher change his attitude way too quickly? Wasn't he chatting very happily just now? Why did he suddenly become so hostile and tell me to get Mason out of here? And then afterwards, he no longer even welcomes Manchi himself? Isn't this a bit irrational? You seem rather confused about this. Speaking of that, it's not without reason that you took so long to advance to Great Mage. You're not using your brain properly. Why do you think I chatted that pair of father and son so much? Isn't it because I don't want to hear about their proposition? If not for the sake of those old guys at the Black Tower, I would have already kicked them out too. But why? Teacher, didn't you say before that the cooperation with Manchi was truly advantageous? That would bring benefits to our Sage Tower without bringing any troubles. Solomon hadn't explained his sudden change of heart, and thus Solon couldn't understand. That was before. Solomon looked at his disciple unhappily, a sneer appearing on his old face. That father-son pair really thinks that I'm clueless because I'm old. Loch Merlin's shipwreck last month definitely had the shadow of the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce behind it. Had it novel been at. This time, Solon didn't say anything. He only glanced at the old man while having some doubts in his heart. Loch Merlin's death was a month ago, and you're only just now thinking of fighting for justice? Since when did you become so righteous? Why are you looking at me like that? Solomon suddenly flew into a rage, viciously lashing out at his disciple. Are you implying that I, your teacher, am not a man of justice? That's why you spent so long to become a great mage. It really makes sense. You really can't understand the path your teacher is teaching you. No. Teacher, you misunderstand. Faced with such vicious scolding, the young great mage was quickly driven to the verge of tears. Forget it. This isn't important. Solomon waved his hand and let his only disciple off the hook for now. What's important is that the owner of the pass is Loch Merlin's son. Since that's the case, I need to be righteous here. Why is that? Because that pass was granted for an alchemy potion. You mean the alchemy potion that we received a few days ago? As Solomon's only disciple, Solon naturally knew that a few days ago, someone had brought a potion to the Sage Tower and exchanged it for the pass that granted the highest privileges, but Solon still wasn't clear about the details of the potion. Even hearing Solomon talk about it now, he still felt a bit unconvinced. That potion is that important? If you dare to ask that in front of Thorpe, he will be happy to air dry you until you shrivel up and then turn you into an experiment. The young great mage immediately shrank back. Great alchemist Thorpe, one of the 3 people in charge of the Sage Tower. If he really wanted to turn him into an experiment, then even his teacher's reputation might not stop him. That was the only dangerous person in the entire Sage Tower that would dare to curse in front of his teacher's desk. However, after the initial twinge of fear, Solon couldn't help feeling curious. What kind of potion would make the 3 big shots so interested? Originally, Solon had guessed that this potion might have used some precious materials or might have been something that one of them had needed for a long time. But Solon definitely didn't expect that it would be so serious. Serious was the wrong word. Would Thorpe really have made him into an experiment for questioning the importance of that potion? I'm not just trying to frighten you. You just haven't seen old Thorpe's reaction. Excited wasn't enough to describe him when he held that potion bottle. He was stuttering and stammering as he shouted something masterpiece, something great master, something bound to be written in history books, and so on. In any case, he was in a bizarre state. The young mage became even more intrigued. Thorpe was a publicly known figure with the greatest achievements in potioneering in the entire Thousand Sail City, and he had always set his gaze very high. Even that great alchemist of the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce didn't enter his sight, as he had always been disdainful of both predecessors and newcomers. For many years, Solon had rarely heard him give anyone the slightest bit of praise. Just hearing the words acceptable from him was already an honor. But he actually lost control of himself, even talking about it being written in future history books. Was that potion really that miraculous? He wondered. You know me, I'm not an expert in potioneering alchemy. Solomon glanced at his disciple, giving him a rather irresponsible answer to his unspoken question. In any case, I heard Thorpe say that each bottle of this alchemy potion might bring another great mage to the Sage Tower. Just as he finished this sentence, Solon couldn't help sucking in cold air. What was all this about great master, masterpiece, and history books? The matter of great mages was far easier to understand. The Sage Tower had a total of 13 great mages, of which only 7 resided there permanently. The big 3 had usually remained in seclusion for most of the past decade, and the Sage Tower's external expansion, fights over resources, and other conflicts were simply in the hands of these 7 great mages. In other words, the current Sage Tower status was half established by these great mages. That was the case with 7 great mages. If it really was like Thorpe had said, and each bottle of potion was able to bring a great mage to the Sage Tower, then Solon really didn't dare to imagine what kind of scene it would be. It was no exaggeration to say that any power that could obtain the favor of that great alchemist might easily be able to rival the Sage Tower in Thousand Sail City. This was a factor that the 3 big shots had taken into account. If that person had a way to restrain the 3 of them, then destroying the Sage Tower might be as easy as waving his hand. Thinking of this, cold sweat dripped down Solon's forehead. The bright side was that the great alchemist apparently seemed to prefer remaining inconspicuous. He hadn't made his plans public yet, whatever they were. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had a young mage deliver the potion and then gifted the pass to another young mage. The key to figuring these things out should be these 2 young mages, especially that Moffa Merlin. He should have a rather close relationship with the creator, or else the alchemist wouldn't have given him the pass. No wonder teacher would have such an attitude, Solon concluded. If it really was like teacher said and the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce was linked to Loch Merlin's shipwreck in a bad way, and their plot was brought out to light, then that Chamber of Commerce might face the fury of an incredible great alchemist. As Solon considered the idea, Solomon concluded their discussion. Knowing the current situation, only a fool would cooperate with the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce. The young mage suddenly sympathized with that father-son pair. In order to cooperate with the Sage Tower, they had prepared for half a year and accepted all kinds of conditions. But in the end, it wasn't as good as a single potion. Okay, I told you everything that you needed to know about this, so you decide how to handle it. Don't always rely on me. You'll take over my seat sooner or later, after all. It'll be good for you to learn how to deal with these kinds of matters. Yes, I'll take care of it. A month passed. Ever since that conversation in the reception room, Solon had felt that paying close attention to that young mage was an absolute must. From his observations, Solon found out that this young mage was truly interesting. His range of reading material was really vast, from light reading material about Nascent's history to the profound and abstract knowledge of the Gilded formula. He would casually hold a book and read it all day long. Sometimes, Solon even doubted whether there was any sort of criteria for the books he picked out, or if he was just reading for the sake of reading. Quite a few times, Solon wanted to remind him that the chance to enter the Sage Tower's library really was a rare opportunity. Many mages would even sell their entire family fortune for the chance. While he didn't seem to be cherishing it, picking random books every day, completely without rhyme or reason, sometimes reading them with great interest as though he was just reading for fun. Solon wanted to tell him that he might one day regret treating this opportunity so lightly, and today was such a day. Solon went to the library after breakfast. As always, he glanced at a particular corner because he knew that every day at this time, that young mage would sit at the same desk and would spend the whole day reading after casually picking up a book. Sure enough, when Solon glanced there, that young mage was already sitting at his seat, holding a book with a red striped cover and reading it with great interest. Here we go again, Solon sighed. It didn't seem to be light reading today, but in Solon's eyes, this wasn't too different from light reading. The red stripes on the cover meant that the knowledge of the magic book was at least great mage level. For a recently advanced first-rank mage, how could it not be leisure reading? Moreover, it wasn't the first time Maffa had done something like that. Solon even saw him reading a silver-striped magic book with great interest once. That was preposterous, as that meant that the contents included knowledge on the level appropriate for high mages. Solon really couldn't stand watching anymore. How could a mage who wasn't respectful of knowledge itself have any accomplishments in magic? Even a book that only great mages were qualified to read was just leisure reading material to him. He definitely wasn't pondering over the information, as he wasn't even taking notes or pausing. He was simply flipping through page after page with a pleased expression on his face, to the point that Solon even wondered if he was trying to study at all, or just relaxing. Solon would have been astounded if he discovered that he had actually guessed correctly this time. Linyan truly had tired himself out this month. In order to quickly understand the current era, Linyan had swept across more than a dozen bookshelves. Such frightening reading speed. If someone else had tried that, their mind might have already melted. When Linyan walked into the library today, he decided to take a rest day and not overwork his brain with the relatively dry and uninteresting historical knowledge or the task of comparing the magic knowledge of the two different eras. He decided to look for a relaxing book to pass time. Thus, Linyan picked up a book called the Fanruzen Formula. To Linyan, these books that were intended for great mage were nothing more than leisure reading material. It definitely didn't require much brain power for him to read page after page. From time to time, he would find some mistakes inside and would mutter to himself, criticizing the errors. Sitting under the gentle rays of the sun, reading a light book while scolding the author, truly a beautiful life. TSK, TSK, TSK. A high mage that doesn't know right from wrong. He still believes in that superstitious seven-string theory. Shrinking the mana whirlpool and cross-arranging. Such a mess. What is a mess? When Solon approached, he happened to hear that last part and couldn't help giving that young mage a strange look. Good morning, Mage Solon. Nothing is a mess. Did you mishear? How could Linyan own up to his words just now? He just raised his head and answered, playing dumb. Is that so? Solon smiled and did not comment. He didn't pursue that line of questioning. as he felt that it didn't really matter. He had come over to give some reminders to this young mage out of goodwill, after all. Perhaps it was because he had gotten his past too easily, but this young mage wasn't treasuring it at all, and whether it was the way he chose books or his attitude while reading these books, they both seemed too casual, lacking the proper seriousness. He might not feel anything about it now, but in a few years, when he strove to attack the great mage realm, he would definitely feel regret that he wasn't conscientious enough back then. As someone who was more experienced and who could be considered part of an older generation, Solon really didn't want to see something like this happening. Sometimes, if the opportunity was missed, it couldn't be grasped again, and it would be too late for anything but useless regrets. Had it novel been at Mage Merlin, that Solon started talking, before hesitating a bit. Although this person was merely a first-rank mage, behind him most likely stood a great alchemist. Naturally, he couldn't lecture him in a way that might draw his ire. What? After a slight pause, Solon answered, "It's not an important matter. I just came over to ask if Mage Merlin had any requests. You are one of the noble guests with the highest pass, so if you have any requests, we will definitely satisfy your needs." After this polite opening, Solon stopped and suddenly said, "Oh right, Mage Merlin, I wonder if you need some book recommendations? I worked here for 2 years and could be considered to have some understanding of the books here." Solon felt a bit helpless about having to be so polite to a first-rank mage. He couldn't do anything about it, since there might be a hidden great alchemist behind this fellow. In this situation, even his teacher Solomon didn't want to act without thinking. Even if he wanted to give him a suggestion, he could only recommend it very tactfully. He had to consider the consequences, after all. If he was too direct, he might exasperate this young mage, and who knew what kind of temperament he might have. Thus, Solon could only inwardly sigh. "I've given you the opportunity. It's up to you whether you grab it or not." "How could I trouble you with that?" Lin Yun felt that this was a bit of an annoyance. He had finally decided to take a rest day. "What kind of recommendation can you give me? Are you disturbing me on purpose?" But declining was no good, because Lin Yun could tell that this library manager really had good intentions. Thus, Lin Yun could only say a few polite words while inwardly considering what kind of excuse he could use to brush him off. Mage Merlin is truly too polite. Regardless of anything else, you are an esteemed guest of our Sage Tower, so offering you a bit of help is definitely something we should do. The young great mage then started enthusiastically introducing a few books. "You should be a first-rank mage, right? If you're interested, I would recommend you to study God's notes." Those notes were left behind by Archmage God, the last Archmage of the Third Dynasty. He recorded all his experiences during his progress through the mage realm. All right, Farrell's Conjectures is another interesting read. Although many of his theories have already been proven to be wrong, I personally feel that the way he pondered through novel ideas with a wild imagination is worth learning from. Sure, I'll go take a look later." Despite this young great mage being very passionate about the matter, to Lin Yun, these recommendations really weren't worth mentioning. They were too shallow and were for complete beginners. They couldn't even be leisure reading materials for him. Reading through them would only have a hypnotic effect, making him drowsy. "Okay, and if these don't interest you, then I would suggest that you research the Flame Spear spell. That's the spell closest to Great Mage level spells. You might need it in the future." Sensing that the other side was answering perfunctorily, Solon's tone became harsher. He especially emphasized the last word, future, to remind him that he was but a mere first-rank mage now. Unfortunately, Lin Yun had no reaction after hearing that. In fact, the mention of the Flame Spear spell made him remember something else. "Oh right, Mage Solon, I heard that the Sage Tower seems to have collected the full Star Path incantation. I wonder if I could be allowed to broaden my horizons?" If there were any spells in this era that could interest Lin Yun, Star Path would be one of them. Even at the peak of the magic civilization, countless years later, those powerful mages still had a very high assessment of that particular incantation. Lin Yun had actually seen the Star Path incantation in that decaying library, but that one had already passed through countless edits and revisions. Lin Yun had never seen the original version. Star Path. Solon almost laughed out loud when he heard that. It was true that the Sage Tower had collected the entire Star Path incantation, but that spell was on the level of forbidden magic. Even if the big three joined hands, nothing would come of it. How could a mere first-rank mage dare to think about it? Not knowing whether he should laugh or cry, Solon answered once again, but he wasn't as polite as before. Mage Merlin, don't you think it's a bit too early for you to study Star Path now? Well, I say it might not be pleasant to hear, but you're a first-rank mage. There aren't that many books suitable for you in this library, and so the choices that would be proper for you are really limited. There is no one that can jump through into the heavens of the magic world in a single step. Even if I arrange the Star Path in front of you, would you be able to understand any of the runes? Linyan very much wanted to answer that he would indeed be able to understand them. I have seen them so many times. How could I not understand them? Unfortunately, the young mage didn't give him the opportunity to answer. Well, Mage Merlin, I still have something to take care of, so I'll take my leave. Solon exited the library with a belly full of grievances, and after thinking for a bit, he once again returned to the study at the top floor of the Sage Tower. Solomon was sitting by the fireplace, a gray blanket covering his thin body, a magic book propped open across his knees, with a fierce cough bursting out from time to time. Teacher's body is getting worse. Solon sighed inwardly when he entered. Solomon had been seriously injured 20 years ago. This was a secret that only a few people of the Sage Tower knew about. Most mages didn't know what had originally caused his condition. It was because of this serious injury that Solomon had lived a life of seclusion for so many years, his strength stopping at the peak of high mage, unable to break through. Teacher, your cough is getting worse. Should I ask High Mage Thorpe to make a few potions for you? No. Thorpe's potions are too unpleasant to drink. I don't want to drink those horrors. In any case, it's been so many years and my body still hasn't failed yet. Understood. Solon had a sad expression. Solomon's condition was the thorn in the minds of all the mages of the Sage Tower. Everyone hoped for the High Mage to recover soon, but no one found an effective remedy. Even the great alchemist Thorpe had tried for 2 years before having no other choice but to give up. He was only able to refine a few potions for Solomon from time to lessen the pain when his condition flared up. In fact, Solomon himself didn't really take it to heart. All right, you came from the library? How are things with that young mage, Merlin? Still the same. He would come first every day and leave last. You have been in contact for so long. What do you think of that young mage? He behaves very well, and he is very smart and courteous, but he seems to be reaching for what is beyond his grasp. Solon thought about what had happened in these past days, hesitated for a while, but then finally explained, oh right, today he looked at a book on the Van Roosen formula. When I went over, I seemed to have heard him saying that it was a mess. A mess. Solon carefully thought back to what he had heard and hesitantly continued. It seemed to be about the 7-string theory. It had only been some mumbles under the breath, and Solon himself hadn't taken it to heart. However, he hadn't expected that these words would make the old mage resting with his eyes closed suddenly sit up straight and give him a sharp look. Are you saying that he looked at the Van Roosen formula and assessed that the 7-string theory was a mess? Yes, that should be what he said, more or less. Solon was a bit overwhelmed by his teacher's sudden reaction. That's not completely implausible. Solomon smiled and then chanted an incantation. A bony finger softly slid through the air as huge amount of mana gathered at his fingertip. A light that was visible to the naked eye streaked across the air in front of him, and immediately after, the entire region of space before him seemed to be torn apart, exposing a curtain made of white light. In this light curtain, a young mage was sitting at a desk, leisurely looking at a book, a smile appearing on his face from time to time, while he seemed to be mumbling some things to himself. This was a replay of everything that had happened in the library earlier. The High Mage's temporal recall could even track a scene that had happened more than 10 years ago, let alone a scene that had just taken place nearby. Of course, the more recent the event, the clearer the scene would be. Even now, the scene in the light curtain was so clear that each hair of the young mage could be clearly seen. Even Solon had no problem seeing all the details from behind his teacher. That young mage was holding the book about the Fanruzen formula, flipping through the pages very quickly while having a weird smile plastered on his face, as if he was looking at something ridiculous. What is so ridiculous about it? The young Solon thought for a long time, but he couldn't understand. But the high mage before him seemed to have noticed something as amazement suddenly appeared on his old face. When he reached the 12th page of the book, the young mage on the light curtain put the book down, and the smile on his face seemed even more derisive as he mumbled some things while face-palming. At first, Solomon's face was filled with amazement, but when he realized what the young mage had mumbled, the high mage suddenly paled, and the right hand casting the temporal recall suddenly shook, causing the curtain of white light to flicker, making the image lose focus. "Teacher," the young great mage was worried. It was the first time in many years that he had seen his teacher forget himself in the Sage Tower. "It's nothing." Solomon shook his head as he scattered the temporal recall spell, which had already lost its stability. "Okay, you leave first. I need to think about something." "Yes, teacher." After Solon walked out, the study became quiet once again. Solomon sat still for a bit before getting up. He went to a desk at the edge of his room and sat down to begin writing a letter. This letter was written to Star Sage Juyi, one of the 3 archmages of the East. He was also the one who had taught Solomon for 20 years. Solomon wrote down everything he had just seen while using temporal recall. Solomon didn't tell Solon that Mafa Merlin wasn't the first mage who had said that the 7-string theory was a mess. The words had made Solomon remember that he had heard at least one other mage say that before. Adat Novel Benedat. And that was Star Sage Juyi. A few years ago, there had been some research done on the 7-string theory in the Cloud Tower, and the one in charge of that task was the Star Sage. At that time, he had said the same words, that the 7-string theory was simply a mess. It had sent who knew how many mages down a winding road. But the research into the 7-string theory in the Cloud Tower didn't make much progress. They lacked a few crucial pieces of data, causing the whole project to stagnate. But just now, upon seeing the 12th page of the Fanruzen formula, that young mage had mumbled a few sentences to himself. Temporal recall didn't reproduce any sounds, so Solomon didn't actually hear what the young mage had said. However, he had become very good at lip reading because of how often he had used this spell. The mage had muttered something in the Nesser language. His words contained 4 key pieces of data, and those 4 might be the key points that could prove the 7-string theory wrong. This was why Solomon had been so agitated. After finishing the letter, Solomon sealed the envelope and called for Solon to come back in. "Send this letter to the Cloud Tower. It is for Star Sage Juyi." "Yes, I will ensure that it is done." "All right, tomorrow when Mafa Merlin comes, invite him here. I have some things I want to ask him." "I will, teacher." When Solon withdrew from the study room once again, his mind was full of doubt. After all, Solomon's study wasn't a place that just anyone could enter. Even Monshi and Ryan had only been invited to the reception room. One of them was a rich businessman of Thousand Sail City, and the other was a great mage that wasn't even 30 yet, and they had came with a huge plan that had been prepared for months. What was so special about that young mage? But the comment about the mess had made his teacher lose his self-control and fail to maintain the temporal recall. And now he was even inviting that young mage to his study for a chat. In the end, Linyan didn't go to the library the next day. That day was the day of the Gilded Roses reopening. With the 30,000 gold from the auction, the old butler was a lot more relaxed. Not only had they settled Ferrio's debt, but the butler had even begun to draw up plans for the revival of the flashing gold chamber of commerce. Linyan originally didn't want to worry too much about it. 30,000 wasn't that big of a number, and he could just casually buy some magic materials to deal with the daily expenses. But reviving the flashing gold chamber of commerce, wasn't that a bit too much? But the old butler couldn't wait to settle that matter. After Linyan turned him down a few times, the old butler began to act like a rascal. He would sigh every day within Lin Yun's hearing range, talking about how he was getting on in his years and that he knew he didn't have long to live. If he suddenly departed and met the old master in the heavens. Would he have to explain that after so many years of flourishing, the flashing gold chamber of commerce was now on the verge of death? In the end, Lin Yun had no choice but to make concessions. There was no point mentioning the revival of the flashing gold chamber of commerce yet, but the Gilded Rose could actually be reopened almost immediately. Thus, the 20-some thousand gold that was left over was put into renovation, employee recruitment, and material purchases. Not much remained of the money. The old butler was left dumbfounded. What can we do? We have no money left. What about the alchemist? An alchemist workshop without an alchemist. What difference is there from opening a restaurant without a chef? When this matter had come to light, the old man had gained a few more white hairs. Nothing could be done about it, since alchemist had very high status. Even if all the 20,000 gold had been used for it, it would only have been enough to pay for the wages of a peak alchemist for perhaps 2 months, let alone now that they only had a few hundred gold left on hand. Did they have to hire apprentice alchemists to make it up? This would ruin their reputation. Since there was no other choice, Lin Yun had to personally act. After coming out from the Sage Tower the day before, Lin Yun did not head straight home, instead heading to the alchemy laboratory of the Gilded Rose. He spent the entire night using the remaining cheap materials to make a dozen potions, along with a few magic armors and magic weapons. As for magic tools, he was powerless to do anything about it. He was restricted by the shoddy materials. Even if Lin Yun had knowledge that transcended the era, he couldn't make miracles out of nothing. As for the grand reopening, there was no need for Lin Yun to worry about it. This was in the hands of the old butler. Lin Yun simply handed over the results of one night of work before finding a room in the Gilded Rose to sleep. After spending the night hard at work, even an energetic alchemist wouldn't be able to handle it. Lin Yun's mana whirlpool was far more robust than that of ordinary mages, while his mind had the knowledge of alchemy far beyond the people of this era. Many problems that his contemporaries would be unable to settle were casual matters in his hands. But even if that was the case, this night had exhausted all of Lin Yun's energy, as the mana whirlpool within his body had been working on overload, almost exhausting his reserves. It was quite nice to be able to lie down for some rest. He kept sleeping through the afternoon, and when the sun was about to set, Lin Yun was woken up by a loud sound. "Someone is courting death," Lin Yun said, still half asleep, before turning to face the other side to try to rest a bit more. But it seemed that the person outside was deliberately set against him. Before he even finished rolling over, he heard a loud bang come from outside. It wasn't from the door, but from the sales counter. "Cut it out already." This time, Lin Yun could no longer bear with it and angrily got out of bed, dressing himself and heading for the door. "I want to see who dares to cause trouble here." After entering the hall, he saw a group of people in a circle. A shelf had been knocked down, the counter had been smashed, and the recently decorated hall was left in a complete mess. A few employees were already ducking on the side while the old butler was arguing loudly with that group. One young mage seemed especially conspicuous. "Smash everything. You dare sell fake items to me? Don't look at me like that. You think that I'm easy to bully? I'll let you know, old geezer, if you don't hand Merlin to me right now. Not only will I smash this thieving shop, I'll report it to the Chambers of Commerce Union and have thousands Sail City's people take a look at how shameless the flashing gold chamber of commerce is. Get the hell out. This place doesn't welcome you." The old butler had followed Loch Merlin for 20 years. He considered the reputation of the flashing gold chamber of commerce more important than his own life. Hearing Mason insulting the flashing gold chamber of commerce, the old man burst in anger, and regardless of whether they were customers or not, he raised his hands to push Mason toward the exit. The old butler was an ordinary person, so even if he had been 20 years younger, he wouldn't have been able to threaten a mage. But Mason simply wasn't paying attention to the old butler, being too excited, gesticulating and splattering saliva while shouting, and thus he was shoved back, causing him to stumble. "Old geezer, you dare to hit me?" This time, Mason had an even nastier expression. A mighty mage was almost pushed down by a 60-year-old butler. After recovering from staggering, a fierce glint appeared in Mason's eyes, and the magic staff in his hand was activated, the gem at the end letting out fierce mana fluctuations. Give a try. Lin Yin had already arrived during the argument, and although there was a smiling expression on his face, the mana fluctuations around him let everyone know that if Mason dared to make a move, the young master would definitely not be polite. Merlin, you came just on time. As he saw Lin Yin appear, Mason didn't dare to attack the old butler, but he still kept his overbearing attitude. I came with good intentions and brought friends for your Gilded Roses reopening to give you some business, but I didn't expect you to be selling fake items. My friend just drank your potion and has some problems. You should compensate him. I know that this Dragon Eye gem is quite precious, but you don't need to raise it that high for me to see. After Lin Yin drew closer, he first pushed away Mason's magic staff before casually asking, "Which potion did your friend drink for him to have a problem?" "It was that healing potion." Mason unhesitantly answered. He had asked around before, and healing potions were truly first-rate potions. There weren't that many alchemists in Thousand Sail City that could craft effective healing potions, and they all had high status. They weren't people that the current Gilded Rose could hire. Moreover, that healing potion was dark red. Only failed healing potions were dark red. Take a look. He already drank more than half of the potion, and his injury didn't improve at all. Moreover, the wound that had already been scabbing started bleeding again. Mason made his subordinates bring a stretcher while explaining. A young person that was perhaps in his late 20s was lying on the stretcher. His right arm was wounded, and after opening the bandage, a deep and long cut was revealed. And from the bloodstains and the residue, it was evident that it had truly been healing before splitting open. I know you have no money right now and can't even afford your uncle's debt, but surely it wouldn't be good to use that as an excuse? For the sake of our friendship, I'll ask my father if he can help you. But what about the fake potions? Mason had a grieving and sorrowful expression, but he was inwardly gloating. You dared to humiliate me in the Sage Tower, so today I'll destroy your workshop and humiliate you in public. Indeed, that so-called friend was someone I spent a few hundred gold to hire. He agreed for me to cut open the wound on his right arm. As for that healing potion, I already had people throw half of it away. The remaining half should be good enough as evidence. With the testimony of that guy and the potion, you will be the one suffering. Mason felt that Maffa's fate was as good as sealed. What will you do? Planning on saying that this healing potion is a real one? Such a joke. You could cheat other people, but you can only dream if you want to cheat me. The Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce has a great alchemist. He patted his chest and guaranteed that a dark red healing potion was definitely a failed product. What do you think? I'm helpless. My friend suffered such a huge loss. What does your Gilded Rose think about that? I have a very simple suggestion. First is to compensate my friend. I guess 10,000 gold should be fine. If you can't procure it, then you are definitely lacking sincerity. In that case, you'll have to admit that the Gilded Rose sold him a fake potion that harmed him and then guarantee that no such things will ever happen again. Even Mason himself felt that the two conditions were harsh. The entire Thousand Sails city knew that the flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce had gone bankrupt and that Loch Merlin's son wasn't able to pay the debt that he owed his uncle. How could he come up with 10,000 gold for compensation? Moreover, before the matter of the compensation was even settled, he still had to publicly apologize and admit that he sold a fake potion. That would truly be a great humiliation. After that, proudly raising his head in Thousand Sail City would be a dream for Maffa Merlin. Of course, when those two conditions were put forward, Mason was already prepared to haggle over the amount of the compensation. When the time came, it would be fine as long as he insisted on the second condition. As for the 10,000 gold, he didn't care much about it, as he didn't lack money. The goal was to ruthlessly trample on that kid's pride. Addit novel Benedette. That sounds reasonable. Our Gilded Rose opened to do business, so if there really was a problem with that healing potion, offering compensation and apologizing is a matter of course. Who knew that Lin Yin would be extremely straightforward and not argue the matter at all? Even Mason, who had always been thinking about how to shame this guy to get his revenge, couldn't help freezing. He had prepared so many more arguments. How can he agree so quickly? Well, it doesn't matter. Saving some effort is also good. Since that's the case, then hurry up and settle it. You should compensate and apologize. I still have things to do. I don't have time to chat with you. Hey, Mason, did you listen to me? I said, if there really was a problem with the healing potion, you should understand the meaning of this, right? Or do I need to explain for you? What do you mean? Mason had an unpleasant expression. Looks like you really didn't understand. Lin Yun regretfully shook his head, inwardly cursing the standards of Nassen's compulsory education before very patiently explaining to Mason. What I mean is if there is an issue with that healing potion, we will definitely compensate and apologize. But if there is no issue with that healing potion, I wonder what Mage Mason plans to do? No problem. Mason lowered his head to look at that half-empty bottle of healing potion, and when he saw the unsightly dark red color, he steadied his resolve and declared, if there is no problem with that healing potion, I'll eat its bottle. Good. Lin Yun nodded and waved to an employee in a corner. You please come over. That employee was about 20 years old. A faint mana fluctuation could be seen on his body. He should be someone who just became a magic apprentice. Nothing could be done about that, as studying magic was very expensive. An average person without a family background like Maffa Merlin or Mason simply couldn't cope with such a huge expenditure. Thus, most magic apprentices would look for work to ease the burden. What's your name? Boss, I'm called Remy. Very good, Remy. Do you want to get a raise of 100 gold to your salary starting next month? If you are willing, roll up your sleeve. Although the young apprentice rolled up his sleeve, his mind was in chaos. His current salary was only 100 gold, so how could his salary double just by rolling up his sleeve? Wasn't that too irrational? While he was thinking about it, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his right arm. Ugh! Remy felt a chill as he looked down and saw that his boss had given him a deep cut. Damn, I knew that an offer to double my salary couldn't be anything good. Good. Help me test the flavor of this healing potion, Lin Yun said as he handed over the remaining half of the potion. Don't just stare at it in a daze. Drink it fast. Remy hesitated a bit, but he ultimately couldn't resist the temptation of having his salary doubled. He ground his teeth before drinking down more than half of the remaining contents of the potion while inwardly hoping, Boss, please don't cheat me. Before he could even finish his thought, the wound on his hand suddenly itched, and under his amazed gaze, the deep cut quickly healed at a visible speed. That healing potion is real. Along with Remy's surprised shout, the others also focused on the wound, especially Mason. His mouth was open, and he couldn't seem to close it. Fuck, how could a dark red healing potion be truly real? A dark red potion is a failed potion. That's what the great alchemist said. This is definitely some sort of trick. How about it? Mage Mason, would you say that our Gilded Rose's healing potion is effective? Lin Yun talked in an unhurried voice, but the tone felt ear-piercing in Mason's ears. He thought for a bit and couldn't think of any other explanation for what had happened, so he glared with an angry expression. Maffa Merlin, you definitely did something. How could a dark red healing potion really work? That must be it. That guy was one of your employees after all. Who knows what kind of trick you prepared? True. After listening to Mason, he nodded and agreed. This healing potion is being sold by the Gilded Rose, and an employee of the Gilded Rose just tested its effects. It does sound a bit too unfair. Good that you know. Mason cut in. He didn't expect that before he could even finish his words, a cracking sound came from under his feet. It was followed by a blood-curdling scream. A blood-red vine suddenly burst out from under Mason's feet. It was a bright red and carried a dense, bloody smell. That blood-red vine quickly wrapped its way around Mason, starting from his feet up until it covered his whole body. It constricted him very tightly, to the point that no matter how much Mason struggled or screamed, he couldn't stop the viper-like vine. The Bloodvine spell, someone exclaimed from the crowd. Indeed, the 5th-rank Bloodvine spell. This was a truly sinister spell. It was rumored to have come from a demon, and had been created based on the blood-sucking vines of the abyss. This magic created creeping tendrils that were just like the blood-sucking vines. Once they coiled around a target, their thorns would enter the target's body and greedily suck out the victim's blood. If the caster didn't stop the spell, the target would eventually be drained until they became a dried corpse. What do you think you are doing? When he thought about what would happen to him, Mason felt the fear of death for the first time, and his voice became hoarse and dry. Didn't I just explain? I agreed that having anyone from the Gilded Rose test the effectiveness of the potion is truly unfair. Thus, I believe having Mage Mason display the effects is a lot better. Lin Yun's voice was still perfectly calm. If not for having just seen it with their own eyes, who would have thought that such a gentle young man was using such a sinister spell? No, don't kill me. I will compensate. I'll apologize. To the panicked Mason, this smile was simply more frightening than any evil grin. Mason, who had never met any setbacks, was truly fearing for his life this time. The blood vines around him were coiling even more tightly as sharp thorns kept piercing his skin one after the other, his blood constantly being absorbed by the thorns. Mason already started feeling his body turning cold. Struggling, screaming, pleading, Mason looked like a sheep under a butcher's knife. Besides incoherently begging for forgiveness, there were only desperate shrieks and rough breathing. The subordinates brought by Mason tried to rescue him, but they couldn't break through the blood vines. Even without Lin Yun's direction, those crazily spreading blood vines were keeping them away. Soon, only a passionate red mass stood out in the room. Lin Yun unhurriedly remarked, "Mage Mason truly loves making jokes. Why would I kill you? The Gilded Rose is open for business, and customers are kings. Killing is something that would never happen here. We are only having a friendly chat to check the effectiveness of this healing potion." Yes, yes. Check. At this time, Mason could only say that much, let alone testing the sketchy potion. Even if Lin Yun made him admit that he was a goblin, Mason wouldn't hesitate at all at this point. Good. Now we can proceed with the testing. Lin Yun looked at Mason before softly lowering his right hand that had been controlling the blood vine spell. The tyrannical blood vines withdrew underground with a burst of magical fluctuations, disappearing in an instant, as if none of this had ever happened. It felt as if they had never even been there. Mason, who had just narrowly escaped death, was the only proof that those tyrannical blood vines truly had appeared. They had tightly coiled around him and pierced his skin with the sharp thorns, leaving numerous small cuts. At this moment, Mason looked as if he had been stung by a hive of bees. Just looking at him made people feel a bit nauseous. Blood was continuously flowing out, and in a short amount of time, a puddle of blood colored the ground. Mason seemed to be at his last breath as he was laying on the ground. Even if an outstanding doctor saw his condition, he would most likely be shaking his head while sending him home to prepare for his funeral. Lin Yun put the remaining dregs of the healing potion in front of Mason, and after looking once again to check Mason's wounds, he nodded with satisfaction. This kind of injury should be convincing enough. Everyone present, including the young apprentice who had been cut a moment ago, immediately felt cold when they heard that inhuman statement. Good there, Mage Mason. I'll have to trouble you to drink this. Let us take a look at the effects. As Lin Yun supported him, Mason managed, with some difficulty, to right himself. He then struggled to drink what remained of the healing potion. The whole time, Mason didn't dare to look at Lin Yun. Those blood vines had definitely left him thoroughly frightened. The healing potion once again displayed its miraculous effects. Mason had only just drunk the last gulp, yet the bloody wounds had already started healing, and after no less than half an hour, Mason could be said to be as good as ever before. If not for his whole mage's gown still being in a mess, Mason could almost imagine that everything that had just happened was a nightmare. An extremely frightening nightmare. After finally waking from that nightmare, how could he dare to stay in the Gilded Rose? After his injury recovered completely, he was about to leave, crestfallen with his subordinates. Hold on. But in the end, the nightmarish voice echoed once again, and Mason completely stiffened up. What is it? Mason managed to get the courage to open his mouth, but his voice was still trembling. At it novel Benedat. Mage Mason, isn't this a bit wrong? Didn't we come to an agreement? If this potion had a good effect, you would eat the bottle. Mage Mason, you can't be like this. You must act with integrity. Mason's face suddenly froze. Seeing that fist-sized potion bottle, Mason truly felt like his heart was dying. "How is it, Mage Mason? Are you eating it yourself? Or should I help you?" "Bon appetit." "Remy, help me take care of it." After Mage Mason is finished with his meal, don't forget to remind him to compensate our workshop for the losses, Lin Yun explained while yawning. He was truly too tired. His output from that whole night of work was equivalent to what many alchemists would need a month for, and he would need to sleep well for a few days to recover. Unfortunately, his idea to go back to sleep was instantly destroyed. Lin Yun had barely turned to leave when a commotion could be heard outside the Gilded Rose, followed by a young mage pushing the door open. This young mage was not yet 30, but surprisingly, the cuffs of his gown had a silver lining. His identity as a great mage was clearly visible. Many onlookers recognized him when he entered. There was only one great mage this young in the entire Thousand Sail City, Monchi's eldest son, Ryan. It was said that Ryan had displayed shocking magic gifts when he was young, and that Monchi had originally planned to send him to Auckland Magic School. But when he was 15, a powerful master from the kingdom paid them a visit and then left with Ryan shortly after. That was 10 years ago, and fairly recently, Ryan, who had already become a great mage, returned to Thousand Sail City. Soon, everyone in Thousand Sail City was shocked. A great mage that had yet to reach his 30s. What kind of idea was that? This was a genius that might not even appear in 100 years. He would most likely be able to set foot into the high mage realm, and at that time, he might become an existence that could walk shoulder to shoulder with those three of the Sage Tower. This sounded especially plausible after the news spread that Monchi and Ryan paid a visit to the Sage Tower, and that Solomon, one of the big three, had personally seen them off. Ryan's reputation in Thousand Sail City became even more resounding. Who was Solomon? He was an existence that was close to being a living legend. For so many years, countless people had visited the Sage Tower, but how many had been personally sent off by Solomon? Those could be counted on the fingers of just one hand. Ryan's name spread throughout Thousand Sail City so quickly that it even surpassed that of his father, Monchi, the president of the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce. Even those young magic apprentices who had just broken through and become mages already viewed him as their idol. The higher-ups of every major power were very courteous to Ryan, especially after they heard that Ryan still had yet to marry and wasn't engaged either. Some families with daughters had begun visiting Monchi to make overtures. Nothing could be done about all this attention. Becoming a great mage before even turning 30 was too dazzling. Even an idiot could understand that. As long as he didn't run into some incredible obstacle, Ryan's prospects would inevitably be bright. Sooner or later, he would become a grand figure comparable to the top three of Sage Tower, or maybe even surpass them. Eventually standing alone at the peak of Thousand Sail City didn't seem impossible. And now, this young great mage with a shockingly impressive reputation was standing at the doorway of the Gilded Rose, dressed in a simple black gown, and besides the silver line on his cuffs, there was nothing extraordinary about him. When he saw Mason with pieces of glass in his mouth, his face didn't even display the slightest hint of anger, as if this person wasn't his younger brother, but a random passerby. "Take him back." With Ryan's words, the hoodlums that Mason had brought with him felt as if they were granted amnesty, and they quickly helped Mason out. This time, Lin Yun only stood there, sizing up that young mage with a curious look. "The Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce will compensate for the damage Mason caused you. Tell me the amount, and I'll send someone to deliver it to you tomorrow." After Ryan entered, he only glanced at Lin Yun and didn't ask what happened or who was right or wrong. He just directly issued this statement instead. Ryan didn't care what this fledgling mage was thinking. As the widely lauded great mage, how could he care about what a newly advanced mage was thinking? "As for you, you used the Bloodvine spell. That Bloodvine spell will be extracted." Ryan's words immediately changed the atmosphere. Spell extraction referred to the process of a mage transferring a spell onto an item at the cost of completely forgetting about it. That item could be a magic scroll, a piece of magic equipment, a magic gem. Anything could do as long as it could hold mana. After transferring it, that item would obtain powerful magic ability and might completely inherit that spell ability. In Nascent's history, there have been several powerful magic tools that have been created that way. But the extraction process was extremely painful to a mage because this was equivalent to pulling the spell out from a mage's soul while still alive. To a mage, this kind of torture for the soul was far more terrible than any magical backlash. In history, those mages who voluntarily had their spells extracted had already reached their limits and had wanted to leave some heritage to their disciples or the later generations. With shocking willpower and endurance, they extract. The number of mages who had done this of their own will, from the 3rd dynasty until now, might not even amount to 10. Ryan talked about it as if it was nothing and asked Lin Yun to have his spell extracted. "Ryan, you are going too far." The old butler stood out with a face red from anger, shielding Lin Yun behind him. Ryan stood there looking at Lin Yun as if the old butler wasn't there. Mason was the one in the wrong, but the prestige of the Monchi family cannot be provoked. "Mafa Merlin, you should know that if I make a move, you'll feel even more pain." "Mage Ryan, you said so much, but there is something I still haven't understood." Lin Yun gently nudged the old butler aside and then smilingly walked towards Ryan. "What's the problem?" Ryan frowned slightly. He didn't like that young mage's attitude. "At it novel been at." Lin Yun stood in front of Ryan, and after scrutinizing him closely, he asked him, "Are you awake?" Ryan didn't react at first, but he then was hardly able to keep his anger suppressed. "A little mage dares to ridicule me. You brought this upon yourself." Ryan fiercely raised his magic staff, and shocking mana fluctuations immediately filled the atmosphere before a vivid red spread through the entire lobby. Amidst cracking sounds, countless blood vines crawled up from the ground. Their growth was quick and violent as they covered the lobby in a bloody color. The same blood vine spell in Ryan's hands and in Lin Yun's hands seemed completely different. This wasn't because Lin Yun's casting ability was inferior to Ryan's. It was the gap between a normal mage and a great mage being too huge. After a great mage got rid of the bindings of the mana whirlpool, their strength reached a whole new level, a completely different world. A mage that had yet to step on that path couldn't imagine how frightening the power of a great mage was. This kind of gap almost couldn't be breached. Regardless of how impressive one was at conducting mana, regardless of how skilled one was with metamagic or the process of casting spells, when faced with that immeasurably huge gap, these could all only be considered funny tricks. The earth-shattering vines instantly flooded the entire lobby. Everyone was enveloped by the frightening vines, and as long as Ryan sent out a bit of mana, the entire lobby would truly be covered in blood. In the eyes of this great mage, those below him weren't even worth mentioning. At that moment, startled shouts and cries for help echoed throughout the lobby, and even the old butler who always refused to admit defeat was now exposing an expression of fear. But Lin Yun, who stood in front of Ryan, had a smile on his face. The blood vines were spreading over from the center of the room, and despite the menacing bloody shadows, the smile on his face didn't change at all. All he did was flick his fingers, and a small flame came out of his fingertips. Among these overwhelming blood vines, that weak flame seemed like a rock thrown into an ocean, and it drifted to the ground while giving the feeling that it would stop burning any time. But then a loud bang echoed. Just as the flame fell on the ground, a raging blaze flared up as if someone had covered the ground in something inflammable. The faint flame turned into overflowing, raging fires as they burn away the blood vines, and only those. In a short time, those large blood vines had all turned to ashes. This had all happened too fast to the point that no one was able to react. Shock was plastered on the faces of all the employees, and Ryan, who had just cast his bloodvine spell, still had his arm outstretched as if trying to channel mana into his recently extinguished spell. After that, a slap echoed out while everything else in the entire lobby remained silent. It was as if time had frozen. Ryan was tightly holding his magic staff, looking at this young mage in front of him, full of disbelief. That slap, just now, where did that come from? As if to prove that this wasn't an illusion, another clear sound echoed out when Ryan had started thinking that it had been all a dream. Another slap. The group of newly hired clerks looked dumbfounded at the scene, blankly thinking, no way. When you're still half asleep like this, you should hurry back to bed instead of sleep-talking in the Gilded Rose. You'll have to compensate for interfering with my business. Lin Yun delivered some stinging words after slapping him twice. The gap between a normal mage and a great mage was truly insurmountable. Even Lin Yun couldn't directly bridge that gap. But it was different for spells themselves. Lin Yun had more than a dozen ways to restrain the bloodvines. Had it novel been at 30,000 years later in No Scent, Lin Yun had even struggled with the pernicious abyssal bloodsucking vines. What was an insignificant imitation spell compared to that? Lin Yun didn't even need to use a spell. He just threw out a wisp of mana seal fire. Even those vines from the abyss would be burnt cleanly. Mana seal fire was the nemesis of the bloodsucking vines. Just a bit would be able to scorch an ocean of bloodsucking vines into ashes. That wisp of mana seal fire had been extracted from a mana seal stone a few days ago by Lin Yun. He had wanted to use it to concoct a dose of burning panacea, but because Ryan had used the bloodvine spell, he could only use up that wisp ahead of time. When he thought about this, Lin Yun felt extremely angry. If you want to help Mason out of his predicament, just do it. Why do you have to talk about the prestige of the Manchi family? Is that even as valuable as a wisp of my mana seal fire? At this moment, Ryan was still completely stunned by the two slaps, or perhaps terrified. He was in complete disbelief. How could he have been ruthlessly slapped by a newly advanced mage, and twice? What had just happened was too unexpected, to the point that Ryan even forgot to block or retaliate. He just stood there lifelessly, his gaze filled with confusion and bewilderment. How could this happen? Wasn't it said that the power of great mages surpassed the power of the normal ones by tenfold, or even hundredfold? Isn't the gap between great mages and mages something that could never be bridged? This guy clearly only just became a mage. Why could he completely ignore my bloodvine spell? How did he do that without even using a spell? How can he slap? Countless questions appeared in Ryan's mind, but he couldn't find a rational explanation. Let alone a rational explanation. He couldn't even find a single excuse to comfort himself. He clearly couldn't just say that he was not prepared or careless to make himself feel better. If an elephant was careless, could it still be tossed aside by an ant? It seemed like nobody in the lobby could move. Ryan stood there in a daze, anger gradually joining the confusion on his face. He wanted to use the bloodvine spell once again to prove that this gap was truly unbridgeable. But those countless questions in his mind kept reminding him to not just act without thinking. During that time, the atmosphere in the lobby became even more strange and tense. But that strange atmosphere didn't last long, because someone pushed the door to come in. Mage Merlin, congratulations. The new arrival was Solomon's only disciple, Solon. With Solon's high status, the reopening of a workshop like the Gilded Rose wasn't worthy of his attention. Solon wasn't just Solomon's sole disciple. He was also the successor of the Sage Tower chosen by the respected High Mage himself. He would become the new leader of the Mage Guild sooner or later. He represented not only himself, but also Solomon, and even the entire Sage Tower. Even if he wanted to come to see this new shop, he would have to take into consideration the reactions of all the forces that might notice. But today was truly a bit special. After the discussion in the study yesterday, Solon decided that he would definitely have a proper discussion with that young mage the next day. Thus, Solon had waited in the library all day, but even after waiting for the whole morning, Lin Yun still didn't arrive. In the end, he felt so fidgety and impatient that he sent someone to inquire. Only then did he find out that it was the day of the Gilded Rose's grand reopening, so the young mage wouldn't be visiting the library today. This got Solon a bit worked up, who was thinking at the time, I have so many unsolved questions. How could you not come? Forget it. I'll visit you myself. Thus, Solon took 2 scrolls of the Sage Tower as a congratulatory gift and rushed to the Gilded Rose, burning with anxiety. The building itself seemed oddly damaged, but perhaps that was a choice of style. When he opened the door, Solon felt as if his brain had short-circuited. What? What happened? That young mage with both cheeks swelling. Isn't he the famous son of the Manchi family? Great mage Ryan of the Ash Tower. How could he look so awkward? Both sides of his face have clear red imprints. Has he been slapped by someone? That can't be. Besides perhaps the big three of the Sage Tower, who would even be able to slap a great mage in Thousand Sail City. No, this must definitely be some sort of a magic ritual I don't know about. But in that case, why is great mage Ryan's expression so strange? Has he truly been slapped twice by someone? All right, there's also that young mage, Motham Merlin. Why is he standing in front of great mage, smiling so leisurely like that? Isn't that attitude a bit too arrogant? As he processed this strange scene, Solon started feeling rather regretful. Why did I have to arrive with such timing? Such a tense atmosphere doesn't bode well for our interaction. Solon gulped awkwardly and forced himself to break this deadlock. Great mage Ryan, such a coincidence. We haven't seen each other in a while, but you still look as elegant as last time. Solon merely said that out of politeness, but to Ryan, it didn't sound like that. This time, Ryan really wanted to swear. Do you fucking have to speak bullshit? I got slapped twice. How could this possibly appear elegant? Great mage Ryan, I didn't mean that. As soon as the words left his mouth, Solon had also realized that he had misspoken. He wanted to quickly remedy it, but he didn't know how he should do it. Never mind. After Ryan took a deep breath, using the opportunity created by Solon's appearance, Ryan regained his bearing. As he calmed down, the bewilderment and confusion on his face slowly disappeared. Everything had happened too suddenly. He had been completely caught off guard by the circumstances. A mage had broken his bloodvine spell and then slapped him twice, leaving him in a stupor. But Ryan was a genius who had broken through and become a great mage before he was even 30. After all, after finally calming down, it wasn't hard to figure out that this fellow simply knew the weak point of bloodvines and that he wasn't actually powerful enough to bridge the immense gap between mages and great mages. With this understanding, Ryan's mood finally calmed down. As long as this was the case, he would get back at him for everything that had happened today, sooner or later. But he definitely couldn't act today, because of Solon's appearance. Solon himself was a great mage, and he was also High Mage Solomon's precious disciple. His arrival itself represented the Sage Tower's attitude. Ryan, who had just calmed down, was greatly agitated by this new discovery. Why would the Sage Tower suddenly display such goodwill for a young mage of a declining family? What did that mean? No good. I have to return and consult with Father about this. Mage Merlin, I hope you'll have such good luck again next time. With these words, Ryan turned around and left, not even greeting Solon. Upon hearing Ryan's parting words, Solon had stiffened in astonishment. It couldn't be, right? His gaze drifted over to Lin Yun before stopping. The sentence was self-explanatory. If Solon only had an inkling before, he was now certain. That Merlin was most likely the culprit behind the red imprints on the young great mage's face. Oh God, when he thought about this, Solon couldn't help holding his breath. That was a genuine great mage. Even if his hands and legs were tied, he would be easily able to kill a few novice mages just by opening his mouth. How could this be? How could he be slapped twice by someone like Motham Merlin? This is too irrational. How many secrets does this young mage have? I have to tell Teacher Solomon about this matter. Congratulations, Mage Merlin. I hope that your business is ever thriving. This is a small congratulatory gift. I hope you'll like it. See you later. After quickly blurting out these words, Solon didn't even wait for an answer as he thrust the 2 scrolls. After Solon left, Lin Yun did not return to his room. Instead, he washed his face with cold water and then picked up the 2 scrolls before heading to the place where he had overworked himself for a whole night, the Alchemy laboratory. Solon's arrival wasn't strange at all. The value of the Spectrum Potion was something that even a new mage like Raymond knew, let alone the Sage Tower that held 3 high mages. What truly baffled Lin Yun was the 2 scrolls that Solon had brought. A few alchemy formulas were written on the two scrolls, and they were relatively uncommon. They would be worth several thousand gold on the market. This was definitely a very good congratulatory gift. But to Lin Yun, these few alchemy formulas weren't important. The key part was the two scrolls themselves. When he first accepted the two scrolls, Lin Yun actually didn't take them seriously and was only being polite. His mind was filled with too many perfected formulas from the end of the magic era. So how could he still care about other alchemy formulas of this period? But after taking a few glances at them, Lin Yun suddenly found out that the letters on the scrolls seemed a bit too bright. After taking a careful look, he realized that these two scrolls had actually been written with dragon blood ink. This is just too shameful, Lin Yun lamented. Too extravagant, too wasteful. The best use for dragon blood ink was for alchemy arrays because the blood of dragons had astonishing amounts of mana within. Not only was this mana very easy to control, but it could even be brought to its full potential with only a few runes. If an alchemy array used dragon blood ink, then the mana source used to power it could be reduced by a few grades because the power of the dragon blood could support most of the array's operations. The mana source would only take an auxiliary role. But here, that dragon blood ink had been used to write a few mere alchemy formulas. Do you need to use precious dragon blood to write an alchemy formula? I wonder which bastard wasted so much. Lin Yun kept swearing while carrying the two scrolls toward the alchemy laboratory. He was unaware that in the distant cloud tower, an old mage sneezed. Afterwards, Lin Yun started getting busy. The always stingy and economical Lin Yun was surprisingly extravagant this time. All kinds of magic items came out, and many bottles of reagents were set up. Lin Yun spent a whole 10 hours working from the afternoon into the night, not taking any breaks. This was how important the dragon blood ink was to Lin Yun. Mafa Merlin's body was far inferior to that of the average mage. After all, if not for Lin Yun's arrival, with Mafa's talents, he might have never become a mage in his lifetime. These kinds of inherent bodily flaws were unsolvable in this era. The only one that could fix it right now was the one coming from the end times, Lin Yun. But the methods were very troublesome, including special meditation or customized potions. Because the meditation would take too much time, Lin Yun unhesitantly chose the latter option. The name of this potion was Mana Baptism. At the peak of nascent magic civilization, nearly every newborn kid would receive a mana baptism. This mana baptism would not only enable them to gather their first bits of mana, but it would also greatly increase their constitution. Thus, in that era, nearly everyone would be gifted. Everyone would stand at the same starting line, and there was no longer any requirement of a minimum amount of innate talent. What would decide their future would be their efforts and their luck. Afterwards, along with nascent mana exhaustion, fewer newborns were able to enjoy a mana baptism. After the most powerful mages were buried in the sand, no more of those precious potions appeared in no scent, because there were no longer any mages that were able to slay a dragon. Dragon blood was the most important component of mana baptism. Without dragon blood, mana baptism would only become a common potion and wouldn't be able to bring forth the mana gathering effect, let alone further increasing one's constitution. Even though he had returned to this era that was so rich in resources, Lin Yun still couldn't avoid the headache of having to obtain some dragon blood. It was truly too uncommon, let alone a fledgling mage. Even some high mages might not be able to see a drop of dragon blood during their lifetime. They were in existence far above high mages. Extremely tyrannical physical power combined with magical abilities inherited through their bloodlines let the dragons stand proudly at the top of nascent's food chain. From ancient times till the current day, there had been no more than 3 people that could slay a dragon. Each of them could be considered genuine legendary figures. When Lin Yun had included this in the list of things for Raymond to get, it was with a just-in-case attitude. He wasn't actually expecting to hear any news of it on that side. He had been prepared to struggle for a long time to obtain some. If it came to it, he would first operate the flashing gold chamber of commerce and build it up before relying on financial resources. If 100,000 gold wasn't enough, then he would use 1,000,000. He would even use all of his family fortune to get a drop of dragon blood. At that time, Lin Yin couldn't have thought that someone would just drop by and gift him a drop of dragon blood. Naturally, it was too early to say that this was actually a drop of dragon blood. It was at best a few alchemy formulas written with dragon blood ink. But it was already enough for Lin Yin. These formulas were written with dragon blood ink, which obviously contained dragon blood. What Lin Yin needed to do now was to reconstitute the dragon blood ink from the alchemy formulas and then extract the true dragon blood from the dragon blood ink. It sounded very simple on paper, but carrying it out was an extremely complicated process. First of all, there were no fewer than 37 formulas for making dragon blood ink. Even if Lin Yin already knew all the current 37 formulas, he couldn't find out in a short time which one had been used for the ink on the 2 scrolls. The only way was to do some testing. This was a large project. The importance of dragon blood ink lays in using the power of the dragon blood to amplify the might of the arrays, to the point that it could even replace the mana source. To some extent, each drop of dragon blood ink was like a miniature alchemy formula. Thus, the formula of dragon blood ink was famous for being complicated. During those 10 hours, Lin Yin compounded almost 100 bottles of all kinds of reagents. He then used those reagents to various types of testing, all the way until it was the afternoon of the next day. After a whole 24 hours had passed, he had only eliminated 2 of the 37 formulas for sure. By that point, Lin Yin was no longer able to keep going. Analyzing the dragon blood ink's formulas wasn't something that could be completely solved with just the reagents. It relied more on the alchemist himself, while the reagents were only the materials. Analyzing the formulas would consume a great amount of energy and mana. Ordinarily, it would take a group of a few alchemists, sometimes even a dozen, working together to carry out something on the level of the dragon blood ink analysis that Lin Yin was doing. If word of his feat spread out, it might frighten many people. After eliminating 2 of the formulas, Lin Yin decided not to continue. Otherwise, he might collapse before managing to extract the drop of dragon blood. He washed his face with cold water and then told the old butler that unless he gave his authorization, no one was allowed to enter the Gilded Rose's alchemy laboratory. After doing that, Lin Yin returned to his room to sleep for 20 hours straight. For some time, Lin Yin stayed in the alchemy laboratory day and night, analyzing the formulas, eventually eliminating 20 kinds. If nothing unexpected happened, Lin Yin would be able to completely determine what formula was used in at most half a month. And at the same time, the business of the Gilded Rose also gradually improved. It was the richest district of Thousand Sails City, after all, and the golden signboard of the flashing gold chamber of commerce was very good for drawing attention. Even if a fool was in charge of the place, the business wouldn't be too bad, and Lin Yin was no fool. The potions crafted by Lin Yin had already run out of stock a week ago, and the magic armors and magic weapons had been bought up at very high prices in the first 2 days. Now, most of the items arranged on the shelves of the Gilded Rose were various kinds of alchemy products that the old butler had people import from outside. The price wasn't nearly as high, but they were practical. Add it novel Benedict. From this, it could be seen that the alchemy business was indeed a business that required daily work. Besides all the things that Lin Yin had personally crafted on the first day, the rest was stuff that the Gilded Rose acquired wholesale at a low price and was selling with some markup. They could easily make a profit of over 10,000 gold in under a month. The old butler was even thinking about hiring some alchemists at a high price once the business was back on track the next month. At that time, he would contact the old mercenary groups to get a steady supply of magic materials. His goal of restoring the Gilded Rose to its former splendor was almost in reach. Half a month soon passed. After Lin Yin finally found out which formula had been used, he didn't immediately leave the alchemy laboratory. He busied himself inside for 2 more days before pushing the door open to leave, feeling completely exhausted.